The fire has been burning since 4 in the afternoon. You can tell by the way the coals have settled, no longer crackling, just glowing, a deep amber that throws no shadows worth the name. The room is warm in the particular way of rooms that have been warmed all day, not from the outside in, but from some old patient centre. The curtains are drawn, heavy curtains the colour of dried claret, and they hold the light in. There is a leather chair near the window. Someone was sitting in it not long ago. The indentation is still there, a slow returning. On the side table, a glass with a little amber left in it, a folded newspaper, the date visible if you lean close, though you don't. A pair of reading spectacles set down in the careful way of a man who expects to return to something and then, quietly, does not. The room smells of old wood, pipe tobacco, beeswax, and something harder to name. Something like the smell of money that has been in a family so long it no longer smells like money at all. It smells like wool, like leather bindings, like the inside of a pocket that has held the same watch for 40 years. Outside somewhere a city goes about its business, but the city does not reach this room. The walls are thick, the carpet is thick. The silence is the particular silence of places that were built to keep the world at a distance, and have been succeeding at it for a very long time. You are here, in this stillness. The fire settles. The clock on the mantel moves forward one small notch, and the story begins, not with a shout, not with a revelation, but in the way that all the best old stories begin, quietly, in a room that smells of time, while the world outside goes on not knowing. There is a particular kind of wealth that does not announce itself. It does not need to. It has been around long enough to know that announcement is a form of insecurity, and insecurity is something that old money regards with the same quiet distaste it reserves for loud laughing at dinner, or for ordering the most expensive thing on the menu without first examining the middle of the list. The clubs of the Gilded Age, those great panelled rooms along Fifth Avenue and Beacon Street and Rittenhouse Square, were built, in their original conception, as sanctuaries from precisely the kind of wealth that needed to be seen. They were places where old names came to be among other old names, where the weight of a fortune was measured not in dollars. No one spoke of dollars in these rooms, but in the quiet, unspoken grammar of how a man entered, how he addressed the steward, how he sat in a chair, how he ordered his supper, how little he needed to say. What almost no one talks about, what the history books tend to pass over in their eagerness to chronicle the splendours of the era, is the particular scandal that ran underneath all that splendour. It was not the scandal of poverty intruding on wealth. It was something stranger, and in its own way more revealing. It was the scandal of wealth intruding on wealth, of men, and they were almost always men, who had made so much money, so fast, so loudly, that even the rooms built for the richest people in America closed their doors to them, not because they were too poor, because they were too rich, or rather, because they were too new, too obvious, too much. To understand this paradox, and it is a genuine paradox, one worth sitting with slowly tonight, you have to understand what these clubs were for. Not in the civic sense, not in the practical sense, but in the deeper sense of what they meant to the men who built them, and who spent their evenings inside them. You have to understand what it felt like to sit in one of those chairs, by one of those fires, in a room where no one was performing anything, because performance itself was the thing being excluded. And then you have to understand what it meant when someone arrived who performed, who couldn't help but perform, and what quietly, irreversibly happened next. That is the story for tonight. It is a story told in low voices, in rooms that no longer exist in quite the same form, about a world that has changed beyond recognition and yet left traces in every corner of how we still think about money and manners and what it means to belong somewhere. It is a slow story, a careful story, and it begins, as most things in that world began, with a door. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. Let's begin with the rooms, not with the men who filled them, not with the arguments that eventually divided them, but with the physical fact of the rooms themselves. Because to understand what these clubs meant, you have to start with the wood and the stone and the leather, with the particular quality of light in a room designed to be entered only by invitation. The Union Club of New York City was founded in 1836. It called itself, in those early years, the oldest private club in New York, though some members of older families privately disputed the word oldest, as they disputed most things that seemed to elevate any institution above the family itself. The building at 5th Avenue and 51st Street, not its first home, nor its last, had the quality that the best of these clubs always aimed for. It looked as though it had always been there. Not as though it had been built, but as though it had simply settled into its place in the city, the way a stone settles into the earth over a very long time. The entrance hall was marble, not the showy Italian marble of the new money mansions going up along 5th Avenue in those years, not the kind of marble that made you think of marble, quieter than that. Marble the colour of old cream, veined in grey, polished but not gleaming. The light inside came from tall windows and from lamps that were lit by the steward before the members arrived, so that you entered not into darkness, but into a room already prepared for you, already warm. The cloakroom was near the entrance, and the attendant there knew every member's name. Not just the name, the hat size, the particular way one coat needed to be hung to keep the shoulders from pulling, the preference for one hook over another. This knowing was not performed. It was not the brittle attentiveness of a waiter in a fashionable restaurant who calls you by name the third time you visit, in order to suggest an intimacy that does not exist. It was older than that, quieter, a kind of institutional memory that passed from one attendant to the next as surely as the club's silver passed from one steward to the next. You could walk through the rooms of the Union Club on a Tuesday afternoon in 1880 and find perhaps 30 men at various stages of their day, some reading, some sleeping, in that particular way of men who fall asleep in chairs and wake without admitting they have been asleep. Some talking, not loudly, never loudly. This was one of the things the old members prided themselves on, that the noise of a conversation in these rooms was exactly the noise that a conversation ought to make, present but not intrusive, warm but not effusive. The dining room was the centre of the club's social life, though social life may be too bright a phrase for what happened there. It was more like the social life of families, things spoken at dinner that would mean nothing to an outsider, but that carried enormous weight in the room where they were spoken. The menu was not elaborate by the standards of the fashionable restaurants of the day. There was no grand cuisine, no French chef making spectacles of himself with sauces. The food was good, and it was plain, and it arrived without drama. This was not an accident. The absence of drama in the food was a deliberate statement. It said, "We're not here to be impressed by our dinner. We're not here to perform our wealth through what is put in front of us. We're here because we belong here, and belonging requires no demonstration." The menus at Delmonico's, the fashionable restaurant where the new money liked to eat, were long and spectacular. The menus at the Union Club were short. That was the whole point. The library was small and well used. There were books on the shelves that had been there for 30 years. Histories, biographies, a few novels, the collected speeches of men long dead. The books were not decorative. They had the soft, slightly concave spines of books that have been opened many times, and the kind of faint mustiness that no amount of dusting quite removes because it lives not in the dust, but in the paper itself. Several members had donated volumes over the years. A small brass plate gave the donor's name. This was the form of visible honour the club permitted, a brass plate on a shelf of books that anyone might read. There was a billiard room, carpeted in green baize that was replaced on a fixed schedule whether it showed wear or not. There was a smoking room, the air in which had been accumulating since the club's early years in a kind of invisible sediment of good tobacco and long conversation. There was a card room where whist and later bridge were played with the same absence of visible emotion that characterized everything else in these rooms. A man who won a great deal was expected to receive it with the same expression as a man who lost a great deal. The expression was one of mild interest. The steward was the central figure of the whole operation. He was not a servant in the way that word was used outside these rooms. He was something more specific, more institutional. He knew the table preferences of every member, who wanted to sit near the window, who could not tolerate a draught, who required a particular sort of chair because of an old injury that was never discussed. He knew which members should not be seated near each other on certain evenings, and he arranged things accordingly without being asked. A new member entering the Union Club for the first time in 1875 would have found it difficult to say, afterward, exactly what he had experienced. It was not spectacular. It was not the kind of room that made you stop in the doorway and look around. It was the kind of room that received you, and that was something different. To be received, to find that the room already knew, in some institutional sense, that you were the kind of person who was expected here, was an experience that could not be bought. Or rather, it could not be bought directly. It could only be inherited or married, or very slowly acquired over the course of a generation that knew how to be quiet about the acquiring. The furniture in these rooms was not new. Some of it had been in the club for decades. There were chairs that had held the weight of men who were now old photographs hanging in a side corridor, and there was something in the fabric of those chairs, in the slight hollowing of the seat, the faint darkening of the armrests, that carried that history forward into the present without announcing it. The room held time the way certain fabrics hold light, not by reflecting it back at you, but by absorbing it and keeping it. The light in those rooms deserves particular attention, because it tells you something about what the rooms were trying to do. In the 1870s and 1880s, the clubs ran on gaslighting, a warm, slightly amber light that flickered at the edges and created pools of illumination around each lamp. This light did not fill a room, it organised it. It created small territories of visibility, each one containing a man and a chair and a circle of warmth, and left the spaces between them in a soft half-dark that was not unpleasant and was, in fact, restful. You could sit in one of those lit circles and feel simultaneously present in the room and partially hidden from it. The light offered a form of privacy that the room's physical openness did not. When the clubs eventually converted to electric light, something changed that was not quite named but was widely felt. Electric light was different from gas in a way that went beyond the technical. Electric light was constant. It did not flicker. It did not diminish toward the edges. It did not create the same sense of a room, organising itself around points of warmth. It was more even and more revealing, and the evenness was, in the older members' view, slightly aggressive. A room lit by electricity was a room in which everything was equally visible, which was not quite the same as a room in which the right things were comfortably seen. The transition happened gradually, one club at a time, over the course of the 1880s and 1890s, and most of the old members eventually accommodated themselves to it. But several of the old guard noted, in letters and in the kind of half-serious conversations that clubs permitted, that something about the quality of the evening had changed. The rooms still functioned. The conversations were the same. The dinner was still good. But the atmosphere was slightly harder, slightly more exposed than it had been before. The gas lamps had belonged somehow to a more forgiving era. The carpets in these rooms were also specific. They were thick and they were old, and the thickness and the age served a function beyond aesthetics. They absorbed sound. A footfall on one of those carpets was muffled into near silence, so that men moving through the room moved without the percussion of footsteps that follows you through public spaces. This contributed to the overall quiet of the rooms, in a way that was felt rather than noticed. The way all the best elements of a room are felt rather than noticed. The steward managed the fire carefully, not too high, not too low. The fire was kept at a level that was warm without being hot, that required attention without being a spectacle. A fire that was too high would draw the eyes, would become the centre of the room in a way that displaced the conversation and the reading that were meant to be the centre. The fire was background, in the same way that all the best elements of such rooms were background, present, necessary, doing their work without drawing attention to the work. The silver in the dining room was heavy and old. Some pieces dated from the club's founding, gifts from early members or purchases made in those first years when the institution was establishing its physical character. The silver was polished on a schedule that was not discussed because it did not need to be discussed. The steward and his staff attended to it without being reminded, and the polishing was thorough enough that the silver was always bright, but never looked as though it had just been polished. Newly polished silver has a slightly aggressive shine that speaks of recent attention. Silver that is polished regularly and with care develops over time a different quality, a brightness that seems to be the silver's own nature rather than the product of recent effort. The portraits in the side corridor deserve a moment. Most clubs of this kind accumulated portraits over time, gifts or commissions documenting the men who had shaped the institution. These were not always the most distinguished men by the standards of the outside world. The portraits at the Union Club did not necessarily depict the richest men in New York, or the most famous, or even the most powerful. They depicted the men who had been most thoroughly and most durably part of the institution itself, the founding members, the long-serving officers, the men who had given large gifts of time or money or both to the club's development. There was something instructive about this gallery, if you looked at it carefully. The men in those portraits were not, in many cases, exceptional by the measures that the outside world applied to exceptionality. They were simply men who had belonged deeply and durably to this room, and that belonging was what the portrait commemorated. Not achievement in the world, belonging in the room. The distinction was the entire point. This quality, the holding of time, the absorption of generations, was what the old members prized most, though they would never have phrased it that way. They would have said only that they valued the club's traditions, its membership standards, its atmosphere. But what they meant underneath all those careful words was this: they valued a room that could not be purchased by anyone who had not first been measured against a standard that had nothing to do with price. The price of joining was modest by the standards of the day. The price of belonging was something else entirely. On winter evenings, and the evenings we are speaking of tonight are winter evenings, the kind that come down early and firmly over Fifth Avenue, turning the gas lamps to small warm islands in a darkening sea. On those evenings, the Union Club was at its most itself. The fire in the main room was high, the curtains were drawn, the men who came in from the cold were greeted by name at the door, handed their usual drink without having to ask for it, and found their way to their usual places the way water finds its level, not by thinking about it, but by a kind of long practice that had become indistinguishable from instinct. This was the world then. This was the room that would, in the coming decades, find itself at the centre of the strangest social arguments of the Gilded Age. Not arguments about poverty, not arguments about class in the large sense, arguments about which of the rich people could be permitted to be in a room with which other rich people, arguments conducted in whispers, in the language of silence and subtle exclusion, about whether the wrong kind of fortune was more dangerous to a room like this than no fortune at all. Those arguments were coming. They were already, in 1870, beginning to form in the minds of men who sat in those chairs by those fires, and looked out at the city they owned and felt, with a chill that had nothing to do with the weather, the first faint signs of change arriving. But we're not there yet. For now, the fire is high, the room is warm, and the evening is just settling in. Let us stay here a little longer before we have to look at what it cost to keep a room like this from changing. To understand what it meant to belong to one of these clubs, truly belong, not merely hold a membership card, you have to understand that there was a grammar to it. A grammar in the literal sense, a set of rules that governed how things were said, how they were not said, what constructions were acceptable and which were, if not forbidden, then quietly discouraged in ways that the uninitiated could never quite see but could always feel. Ward McAllister, who spent the better part of 2 decades as the self-appointed arbiter of New York society, put one version of this grammar into words when he drew his famous distinction between what he called the Nobs and the Swells. The Nobs, in McAllister's taxonomy, were the old money, the Knickerbocker families, the Dutch and British descendants who had been in New York since before it was New York. Their wealth was old enough to have lost all memory of being acquired. It simply was, in the way that land simply is, in the way that certain houses simply are, present and unquestioned and without origin story. The Swells were different. The Swells were the new money, the men who had made fortunes in railroads and steel and oil and speculation, often in a single lifetime, occasionally in less than that. Their wealth was enormous. In some cases it dwarfed the old family fortunes in the way that a new building dwarfs an old one, obviously aggressively without apology. The Swells were, in McAllister's phrase, ready to lavish their fortunes on social climbing. They wanted in. They wanted the rooms, the dinners, the quiet acknowledgement of belonging. They were willing to pay for it in any currency that was accepted. The problem, the comic, circular, endlessly generating problem, was that the one currency the clubs would not accept was the currency the Swells had in greatest abundance. Conspicuous wealth, the performance of money. The Swells could build mansions that cost more than the club's own clubhouses. They could throw parties that the old money talked about for years. They could buy art, import horses, commission yachts, and still find, when they presented themselves at the door of the Knickerbocker Club or sent their names forward for membership at the Union Club, that the room had found some quiet way of remaining closed to them. There is something almost tender about this, seen from a distance. These men, some of them the most powerful figures in American economic history, sitting in their enormous houses on Fifth Avenue, aware that a few blocks away there was a room where men who had a fraction of their wealth were at this very moment drinking moderately priced whiskey and reading last week's newspaper in comfortable chairs, and that room was more closed to them than the doors of Congress or the courts of Europe. They could buy almost anything. They could not buy the easy silence of being among people who had no particular reason to be impressed by them. The grammar of belonging in these clubs was precise on the question of money, and what it said was this: money is not a subject, not in the sense that it cannot be discussed. It could be discussed in the carefully indirect way that things were discussed in these rooms, but in the sense that it is not the point. You are not here because of your money. You are here because of who you were, and who you were had nothing essentially to do with your balance at the bank. A man who entered the room thinking about his money, who sat down thinking about his money, who ordered his dinner from the perspective of his money, was already failing some test he hadn't known he was taking. The test was invisible. That was the essential thing about it. There was no handbook. There was no list of rules posted at the entrance. The rules existed only in the behaviour of the men who already belonged, transmitted by example and absorbed over time by the men who were in the process of learning to belong. A young man sponsored into the Union Club by an older member was not told anything about how to behave. He was simply placed in the company of men who already knew how to behave and left to observe. What he observed, if he was paying attention, was a kind of studied understatement in all things. The quality of the whiskey was good but not spectacular. It did not need to be spectacular, because the point of the whiskey was not the whiskey. The quality of the conversation was genuine but not brilliant. It did not need to be brilliant, because the point of the conversation was not to impress anyone. The quality of the chairs was excellent but old. They had not been replaced, because replacing them would have suggested the need for improvement, and nothing in this room was supposed to need improvement. The Knickerbocker Club, founded in 1871 by 18 men who had broken away from the Union Club because they felt that the Union Club's standards had grown too loose, was even more precise about these things. It was founded specifically by men who considered themselves, and considered each other, to be the genuine article. Not the richest men in New York. Some of them were very rich, some were only moderately so, but men of the oldest New York families, descendants of the Dutch settlers whose presence in the city predated by centuries the railroads and steel mills that had created the Gilded Age fortunes. The founding members included John Jacob Astor III, whose grandfather had made the original Astor fortune in fur and Manhattan real estate, and August Belmont, who was the American representative of the Rothschild banking interests, and who wore his European connections with the easy assurance of a man who had been in rooms like this one, or rather rooms like the rooms these rooms were modelled on, for his entire life. There were 18 of them in the beginning. They met in October of 1871, drafted a constitution, and formally established what would become, in the opinion of most people who thought about such things, the most exclusive club in New York. The exclusivity was a product not of high fees or formal barriers, but of an admissions process so subtle and so dependent on personal knowledge that it could not really be described to an outsider. A candidate for membership needed to be proposed by an existing member and seconded by another. The proposal then went before the full membership for a vote. The vote was conducted by ballot, a literal ballot, with black and white balls placed in a box in secret by each voting member. In some clubs, a single black ball was enough to deny membership. The phrase blackballed came from exactly this practice. The blackball was not, in theory, about wealth. A man could be blackballed for any number of reasons, and the secrecy of the process meant that the reason was never made explicit. He might have been blackballed because someone found him dull. He might have been blackballed because someone's wife disliked his wife. He might have been blackballed because he had once, at a dinner years ago, told a story that went on slightly too long and ended with a laugh that was slightly too loud. None of these reasons would ever be stated. The ball went into the box in silence, and the result was announced, and that was the end of it. In practice, however, the blackball was very often about a specific quality that the older members found impossible to tolerate, and that quality was ostentatious wealth. The display of money, the habit, and it was a habit, ingrained in men who had spent their lives acquiring and growing their fortunes, of treating wealth as something to be exhibited, as evidence of who you were and what you had achieved. This habit was, to the old members, not just gauche, but somehow threatening. If a man who wore his money that way was admitted to the room, something about the room would change. The air would be different, the conversation would be different, the whole invisible grammar of belonging would begin to slip. And so they kept the door closed, often to men who were, by any objective measure, more successful than they were, more wealthy, more powerful in the actual operation of the American economy, men whose decisions affected the lives of millions, men whose names would be remembered long after the names of the club's old guard had faded. None of that mattered inside the room. Inside the room, the question was simpler and older. Are you one of us? And the answer, for so many of the new money titans of the Gilded Age, was no, not yet. And for many of them, not ever, at least not in their own lifetime. McAllister himself was a complicated figure in this taxonomy, and thinking about him carefully illuminates something that the taxonomy otherwise conceals. He was from Savannah, Georgia, and his family was respectable, but not wealthy in the Knickerbocker sense. He had come to New York as a young man with ambitions and no particular family claim on the rooms he wanted to inhabit. He had made himself acceptable by the sheer thoroughness of his application, by learning everything there was to learn about what the old money wanted and then providing it, untiringly, for decades. He became, over the course of those decades, the most visible social arbiter in New York, the man who, with Mrs. Astor's patronage and his own relentless industry, defined what it meant to be in society and what it meant to be excluded from it. He organised the patriarch balls, the subscription events that served as the annual theatre of social inclusion and exclusion. He curated the guest lists. He arranged the seating. He was, in the fullest sense, the grammar teacher of New York society. But here is the thing about grammar teachers. They are never quite the same as native speakers. McAllister knew the rules with the precision that comes from having had to learn them, rather than the ease of having always known them, and this was ultimately what undid him. When he published his memoir, Society as I Have Found It, the old money found it revealing in a way they did not like. It showed the machinery. It described the process. And describing the process made visible what the process depended on remaining invisible. The fact that it was constructed. That someone had made the rules, and that the rules could therefore be unmade. Mrs. Astor dropped him. The decision was not announced publicly, but it was felt throughout the social world as clearly as any announcement could have communicated it. The man who had been the arbiter of belonging was, in a moment, no longer belonging himself. The irony was almost too neat to be believable, but it was real. McAllister died in 1895, his social position diminished, his era essentially over. There is a kind of melancholy in this, if you think about it long enough, but tonight we are not thinking about it. We are sitting in one of these rooms, in one of these chairs, near one of these fires, in the long, warm, quiet middle of an evening that is not requiring us to be anything in particular. The fire settles. A clock somewhere marks the quarter hour. Outside, the city continues. In here, everything is still. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The Union Club liked to call itself the mother of clubs, and the phrase was apt in both the affectionate and the slightly ominous sense. It was from the Union Club that most of the other great New York clubs had spun off, usually in a state of mild to moderate indignation about something the Union Club had done or failed to do. The Union League Club in 1863, the Knickerbocker in 1871, and later the Metropolitan. They went out from the mother, each of them carrying some particular grievance, and set up their own households, and then in time became establishments in their own right, with their own traditions and their own disputes and their own sense of what was and was not acceptable. The first major schism, the one that produced the Union League Club, was not about money at all. It was about the Civil War, which shows that the capacity for fracture in these institutions predated the Gilded Age by some years. During the war, several Union Club members had Confederate sympathies, and the club's governing committee declined to expel them. This infuriated a number of members who felt that the club's loyalty to its social traditions was being used as a cover for something that looked uncomfortably like disloyalty to the Union itself. They sent a confidential circular to prominent figures in New York proposing a new club, one dedicated explicitly to the Union cause, and the Union League Club was born. The Union League Club was in many ways the opposite of the Union Club. Where the Union Club valued old lineage, the Union League valued current achievement. It was the club of Republican respectability, of men who had done things and who were pleased that they had done them. It eventually became home to names like Rockefeller and Morgan and others who were building the new American economy. But the Union League Club was, in its own way, one tier below the top. It was respectable, but it was not quite. The word the old money used, when they were being honest, was exclusive. Not exclusive in the way that mattered most. The second great schism, the one that produced the Knickerbocker Club, was more directly about the question that would preoccupy the rest of this story. 18 members resigned from the Union Club in 1871, and the stated reason was that the Union Club had allowed its membership standards to grow too loose. Too many new names, too many men who had money but not the right kind of history. These 18 men, and among them were men like John Jacob Astor III, whose family had been rich in New York since before most of the city existed in its current form, wanted a place where the question of who was acceptable could be settled by a narrower and more exacting standard. The name they chose was careful. Knickerbocker was the word that Washington Irving had used in his mock historical account of the Dutch settlement of New York, a word that had come, over the decades since Irving's book, to suggest not just Dutch descent but something broader. The genuine article, the original New Yorker, the family that had been here before the city became a place worth being from. To call your club the Knickerbocker Club was to make a claim about continuity, about rootedness, about the difference between belonging to a place and merely arriving in it. The founding of the Knickerbocker sent a message that was received clearly by everyone who was meant to receive it. There was now a place in New York where the old families could be among each other without having to share the room with men who had made their money in the last 20 years. This was not, the founders would have said, about snobbery. It was about comfort, about the ease that comes from being in a room where no one needs to prove anything, where everyone already knows who everyone else is, where the work of establishing credentials, which is exhausting work even when you win, does not have to be done. The Knickerbocker's admissions process was, even by the standards of these clubs, notably rigorous. The membership was small, smaller than the Union clubs, smaller than most. A candidate had to be proposed and seconded by members of long standing. The vote was secret. The rules about how many blackballs constituted a rejection were not publicised. Members were almost exclusively of British or Dutch Protestant descent. This was the citadel, as one historian later called it, of patrician families. You could not arrive here. You could only be here already, in some essential sense, before you ever applied. The irony, and it is an irony worth noting before we move on, is that some of the founding members of the Knickerbocker were not, by the strict measure of family antiquity, quite as original as the club's name suggested. August Belmont, one of the founders, had been born in Germany as August Schoenberg and had changed his name on arrival in the United States. His access to the Rothschild banking network, his marriage into the Perry family of Rhode Island, and his evident command of the social graces had smoothed this history considerably. But the history was there, for those who knew to look for it. This was another of the small paradoxes that animated club life in the Gilded Age. The standards that were applied to new money could not always be applied retroactively to the men who were doing the applying. The old families had, in almost every case, an origin story that was somewhat less than the purity they now claimed. The original Astor fortune had been made in the fur trade, not a genteel occupation. The original Vanderbilt money had come from the ferry business, which Cornelius Vanderbilt had run with a ruthlessness that made the robber barons of a later generation look almost moderate. But time had done its work. Time always does its work. Give a fortune 2 or 3 generations, and it begins to look like it simply was. The club members understood this, even if they did not say so. They understood that what they were defending was not some pure essence of old money. That essence did not exist, had never existed, but rather a convention. A useful social fiction that allowed them to feel and to be treated as something other than merely wealthy. The convention said, Some wealth is old enough that it no longer needs to be discussed. Some families have been in a room long enough that they own it, not in any legal sense, but in the more durable sense of collective agreement. The convention maintained itself by treating any challenge to it as a form of vulgarity, which is, when you think about it, a rather elegant solution to the problem of self-preservation. Inside the Knickerbocker Club, the evenings were quiet and the conversations were particular. There was a shared vocabulary among the members, not of jargon or technical language, but of reference. A member might mention a summer in Newport or a family place in the Hudson Valley and find, in the faces around him, the easy recognition of people who have been to those places, who know those houses, who understood without explanation what it meant to spend a summer in the one or a winter in the other. These recognitions accumulated into a texture of belonging that was, in the end, what the club was for. The new money men, the Swells and the arrivists, and the industrial titans who were building the American economy outside these walls understood none of this, or rather, they understood it in the abstract, but they could not reproduce it because it could not be produced. It could only be inherited. A man who had grown up in a house where the summers were spent in Newport and the vocabulary of old New York was his mother tongue, he could enter the Knickerbocker and feel immediately at home, because home was what it was. A man who had made $50 million in the railroad business and who had been trying, for the last 10 years, to learn the vocabulary. He would feel the difference, even if no one showed it to him. Even if everyone was perfectly polite, as they would be. The room would know, and in some way he could not quite explain, he would know that the room knew. This knowledge, the knowledge that belonging was not something that could be achieved, only something that could be recognized, was the source of a particular kind of torment in the Gilded Age. It drove some men to extraordinary lengths. It drove others into the arms of the Metropolitan Club, which was eventually founded precisely because the need for a room where new money was welcome had become acute enough to generate its own supply. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The night is long, the fire is low but still warm. We can move slowly through all of this. For now, let us simply note that the Union Club and its offspring had created, by the 1870s, a hierarchy of clubs that mirrored the hierarchy of wealth in the city with uncanny precision. At the top, the Knickerbocker for the oldest names. Below it, but still elevated, the Union Club for men of good family and proven standing. Below that, the Metropolitan and the Union League for men of wealth and achievement who had not yet, or perhaps never would, acquire the particular credential that mattered most in the rooms above them, and outside all of them, the enormous, frustrated, sometimes furious wealth of the men who had built the new America and found that the old one had a door that all their money could not reliably open. The door was not locked. That was the peculiar cruelty of it. It was simply held. Held by men who did not need to make an effort to hold it, because they had been holding it, or rather their fathers and grandfathers had been holding it, for long enough that the holding had become a reflex, invisible and almost automatic. The door would open, eventually, for most of the great fortunes. John D. Rockefeller's grandson would belong to the Knickerbocker. But that was 60 years away, in a different world, with a different set of assumptions about what money meant and what it was for. For now, in the long, expensive, glittering evening of the Gilded Age, the door held. There was a small wooden box, in the secretary's office or sometimes in the reading room, that was brought out when a vote was to be taken on a new member. The box had 2 compartments, one for white balls, one for black, and a narrow slot at the top through which a member could pass his hand and deposit his choice in secret. The whole device had a quality of almost theatrical understatement. It was not large, it was not ornate, it was simply a box, in wood, with a mechanism inside it that could, when the votes were counted, end a man's social aspirations entirely. The phrase blackballed has survived into the modern vocabulary in a somewhat diluted form. It means now, generally, to exclude someone from something. But in its original context it was very specific, and the specificity gave it a weight that the diluted version has lost. To be blackballed from a club like the Union Club or the Knickerbocker was not merely to be declined. It was to be judged, secretly and without appeal, by a jury of your social peers, and to be found wanting in some way that they were not obliged to explain. One commentator of the era put it precisely. To be blackballed was to be murdered socially. The murder was bloodless, private, and permanent. The number of blackballs required to deny membership varied from club to club, and changed over time within individual clubs. In some, 2 blackballs were enough, in others, 3. In the most exclusive establishments, a single blackball was sufficient. This last arrangement had a particular quality of severity that the members who favoured it did not see as severe at all. They saw it as honest. If even one member of the club found a candidate unacceptable, was that not information worth having? Was the candidate not, by definition, someone who could not be universally welcome in a room where universal welcome was the standard? The secrecy of the process was its most important feature. The man who cast the black ball was never identified. The man who cast the white balls were never identified either. The vote was the club speaking as a single entity, not a collection of individuals, and this meant that the rejected candidate could not address himself to any particular objection. He could not argue the case. He could not find out who had voted against him, or what their reason had been. He could only register the result and accept it, or, if he was unable to accept it, make a quiet scene that would confirm, retroactively, that the black ball had been well placed. The etiquette of the black ball extended to the proposing member as well. If the man he had sponsored was rejected, the proposing member was expected to feel the rejection as a comment on his own judgment. He had, in effect, vouched for someone who the club had found unacceptable. This meant not just that his candidate had failed, but that his calibration of what the club considered acceptable had been wrong. In a world where social calibration was the primary skill, this was a serious failure. A member who sponsored rejected candidates repeatedly would find, eventually, that no one was asking him to sponsor anyone else. This system had a self-reinforcing quality that is worth appreciating. Because proposing a candidate carried real social risk for the proposer, members only proposed candidates they were quite confident would be accepted, which meant that the only candidates who were proposed were candidates who had already, in some informal way, been pre-screened by at least 2 members with enough confidence in their own judgment to put their names to the proposal. The formal blackball process was, in this sense, the last step in a much longer informal process of assessment, and most of the actual exclusion happened at earlier stages, quietly, without the drama of the box. A prospective member who was truly unsuitable would often never get as far as the formal vote. A friend might have a quiet word with him, not a discouraging word exactly, but a word that suggested the timing was not right, the membership was full, perhaps in another year. An existing member who might otherwise have proposed him would find, on reflection, that he wasn't quite ready to put his name to the proposal. These quiet dissuasions were gentler than the blackball itself, but they were exclusions all the same, and they operated invisibly, leaving no record, creating no formal event to be remembered or resented. The cases where the blackball actually fell were the dramatic ones, and they tended to be dramatic precisely because the system had failed at the earlier stages. Either the proposer had misjudged his candidate's acceptability, or there had been a shift in feeling among the membership that the proposer had not detected. Or, and this is where the story of the Gilded Age clubs becomes genuinely interesting, the candidate was someone about whom the membership was genuinely divided. Someone whose qualifications were real, but whose presence would represent a change in the character of the room that some members welcomed and others found threatening. John King was one such case. King was a railroad baron of the kind that the Gilded Age produced in abundance, self-made, forceful, enormously successful, possessing a fortune that dwarfed the inherited wealth of most Union Club members. He was proposed for membership with the backing of J.P. Morgan himself, which at that time was about the most powerful social endorsement available in New York. He was rejected. The reason given, the reason that was whispered in the social circles that discuss such things, was a detail so small it might seem almost fictional. John King ate his food off his knife, not with a knife, off the blade. He transferred his food from plate to mouth across the flat of the blade in the manner of a man who had spent his early years in circumstances where the niceties of table setting were not the primary concern. This detail, the knife detail, became famous in the social history of the Gilded Age, and it is famous precisely because of its apparent absurdity. A man who could rearrange the American railroad system could not get into a club because of how he ate his peas, but the detail was not absurd to the men who cast the black balls. The knife was evidence, evidence of origins, evidence of a kind of self-madeness that could not be disguised by any amount of money or any number of well-cut suits. The knife said, I learned to eat before there was anyone around to teach me which tool to use. The knife said, my wealth is new, and before it was new, there was nothing. That was the thing the old clubs could not assimilate. Not the poverty of origin exactly, but the memory of it. The visibility of the transition. The fact that a man like John King had not arrived at his wealth gradually, over generations, but had come up fast. And fast arrivals leave traces. They leave the knife. They leave a particular way of ordering wine, or of addressing a waiter, or of responding to a question about where one's family summered, that tells the room something the man himself might prefer not to have told. The room noticed. It always noticed, and the black ball was how it responded. The other rejected candidate from that same period, Dr. W. Seward Webb, whose blackballing at the Union Club was part of the same wave of exclusions that eventually led J.P. Morgan to found the Metropolitan Club, was a different case. Webb was married to Eliza Vanderbilt, which made him Cornelius Vanderbilt II's brother-in-law, which made him part of the most visible and ostentatious new money in New York. The Vanderbilts were building their great mansions along Fifth Avenue and Newport in those years. The Breakers, the Marble House, houses that were not houses in any ordinary sense but monuments to wealth, deliberately scaled to impress in a way that left no room for understatement. The old money hated this. Hated is perhaps too strong a word. Disliked, with intensity, in the particular way that people who believe in restraint dislike those who visibly do not. The Vanderbilt mansion said, "Look at this." The old money club said, "We would rather not." The mansion said, "This is what money can do." The club said, "We know what money can do, and we are trying, in our quiet way, to demonstrate something slightly different. That money, at its best, does not need to do anything at all." The rejection of Webb, and the rejection of King, and the broader pattern of exclusions that characterized these years, all of this is, in the end, a story about anxiety. The anxiety of an established elite watching the world change around it, watching new wealth arrive in quantities and forms that it could not quite process, watching the social structures it had built to protect itself strain under pressures for which they had not been designed. The black balls were falling faster in these years. The membership committees were being more careful, or trying to be more careful, though the definition of careful was itself becoming harder to maintain. And the men who were being blackballed were not taking it quietly, as earlier generations of the rejected might have done. They were rich enough to respond. They were building their own rooms, their own clubs, their own structures of prestige. And the rooms they built would, in time, become indistinguishable from the rooms that had rejected them. That is the other story, the longer story, the one we will come to in time. For now, the box is back in the secretary's office. The evening has moved on. The fire has found its low, steady rhythm, and the night holds everything quietly in its long, dark hands. It was not really about the knife. Of course it was not really about the knife. The knife was a symbol, a small, precise, almost poetic symbol, for a set of concerns that had nothing to do with table manners and everything to do with the question of what, exactly, these rooms were for and who, exactly, they were for. But the knife is a good place to begin, because it illustrates something important about how these distinctions operated in practice. The rules of etiquette that governed behaviour in these clubs were not written down in any document. They were not explained to new members. They were absorbed by observation, by proximity, by the long process of being among people who had learned them from people, who had learned them from people who had never had to think about them at all, because the rules had been in their bloodstream since childhood. A man who had grown up in the right kind of household, the kind of household where there was a cook and a housekeeper, where the table was set with multiple pieces of silverware for each course, where the instruction happened not through instruction but through example, that man did not think about how he ate. He simply ate in the way he had always eaten, in the way the people around him had always eaten. The knife lay flat on the side of the plate when not in use. The fork was held in the European manner. The soup was consumed from the side of the spoon, not the tip. A man who had grown up differently, who had worked from a young age, who had learned to eat quickly and practically and without ceremony, that man might have excellent table manners in the sense that he had been told about them and had made an effort to acquire them. But the effort was visible. It was visible in small ways, ways that no one would ever describe directly to his face, but ways that the room read the way a room always reads small signs, effortlessly, comprehensively, and without mercy. The difference between manners learned by observation and manners learned by instruction is something like the difference between a native language and a learned one. The native speaker moves through the language without thinking, producing constructions that are correct not because they have been memorized, but because they feel right, because they are the structures the mind reaches for naturally. The learned speaker produces constructions that are also correct, perhaps even more formally correct than the native speakers, but that have the quality of construction. They were put together, and the ear can hear the putting together even when it cannot say exactly what it hears. Ward McAllister, who made it his life's work to be the arbiter of what was acceptable in New York society, understood this distinction with a precision that comes from having navigated it himself. McAllister was not old money. He was from Savannah, Georgia, from a family that was respectable but not wealthy, and he had arrived in New York with the ambition of a man who knows exactly where he wants to be and is not certain he belongs there. He had learned the language. He had learned it with such thoroughness and such application that he became, eventually, its most visible practitioner. But there was a restlessness in him, a hunger that the old money families did not have, and it showed in small ways, in his proneness to making his mastery visible, in the slightly excessive care he took with his own elegance. McAllister once spent an entire inheritance, a modest one, but still, on a single set of evening clothes for an important ball. He did this because he understood, with the clarity of the outsider who has studied his subject deeply, that the right clothes at the right event could open doors that were otherwise closed. And he was right. The clothes worked. The doors opened. But the fact that he had done it, that he had calculated the expenditure, that he had thought about which clothes and which event and how the one could leverage the other, that was the mark of the Arriviste, however successful the operation. The old money did not calculate this way, or rather, they did calculate, but the calculation had become invisible long ago in an earlier generation, and what remained was the result without the appearance of having been worked for. A man of the old Knickerbocker families dressed for dinner the way he breathed, without thinking about it, because there had never been a time when he had to think about it. The result looked the same. It was not the same. This distinction between the appearance of ease and actual ease was the central obsession of the Gilded Age's social wars. It animated every debate about who should be admitted to which room. It explained why money alone was never enough, and why the lack of money was not automatically disqualifying either. A man of genuinely old family, fallen into modest circumstances, was still more welcome at the Knickerbocker Club than a man of newly made millions, who could not quite hide the newness of them. The fallen gentleman retained the ease. The risen businessman had only the evidence of the rise. The dining rooms of the old clubs were where this distinction played out most clearly and most daily. The rules around the table were precise and unspoken, and they covered everything from the sequence of courses to the acceptable topics of conversation to the speed at which one was expected to eat. Speed is interesting. One was not expected to eat quickly, even if the food was delicious. The food was fuel, in a certain sense. It was not the point. One ate at a pace that suggested one had eaten good food many times before, and would eat it many times again, and that this particular meal, however excellent, did not require any particular urgency. This was the opposite of the way men who had made fortunes in industry or finance often ate. Men who had worked long days and short lunches, who had eaten on the run or at desks or in the brief intervals between one thing and another, those men sometimes brought to the dinner table an efficiency, a barely suppressed sense of getting through something that was legible to anyone in the room who knew what to look for. It was not rudeness. It was not anything one could point to and name. It was simply the trace of a different relationship with time and food and the act of sitting still. The wine was another register. A man who'd grown up with wine at the family table approached it differently from a man who had acquired the habit of wine as an adult, as a social accomplishment. The first man might praise a glass of wine without knowing the vintage, might say only that it was good, and leave the technical appreciation to someone else, because the sensory experience was familiar enough not to require analysis. The second man, who had memorized his vintages, who had made a study of the subject as one makes a study of something one has decided to know, was more likely to say the right things about the wine and in saying them, reveal that he had learned them. The cheese came at the end of the meal in these rooms, after the main courses and before the fruit. This was the European practice, and the old New York families had adopted it somewhere in the middle of the previous century. A new member who asked for cheese before the fish course, who did not know the order, was not corrected. The meal simply arrived in the order the kitchen always sent it, and the member who had asked out of order received the cheese at the right moment without comment. But the request was registered, not maliciously, simply registered, in the way that rooms register things, because rooms remember everything. There were rules about how to address the steward, about whether to leave a card when visiting another member who was not in, about the proper way to acknowledge a greeting across a room versus the proper way to ignore someone across a room, because sometimes the correct social move was a form of careful not seeing that conveyed, without being rude, that the moment was not right. These rules were not written down. They were simply the accumulated practice of men who had been doing these things for a long time, and who had developed, through that practice, a sensitivity to the texture of social situations that allowed them to navigate without having to think. A railroad baron who had built his fortune in the years after the Civil War could hire the best tailor in New York, and the suit would be excellent. He could eat in the finest restaurants in the city, and after enough evenings he would know which fork was which and in which order to use them. He could read the right books, visit the right places, follow the conversations that mattered. All of this was achievable. But there was one thing he could not acquire, however systematic his application: the quality of not having had to acquire any of it. The ease of a man who had never been in a situation where the question of which fork arose for the first time. That ease was the thing, and the ease could not be bought or learned or constructed. It could only be inherited, and only by someone whose parents had also inherited it, and whose grandparents before them. None of this was discussed openly in the clubs. It was not the kind of thing one discussed. The whole apparatus of exclusion depended on its own invisibility, on the shared understanding, among the included, that the standards existed without the need to articulate them. The moment you had to explain what you were looking for, you had already revealed that you were looking. And looking in these rooms was a form of need, and need was the thing being excluded. There is a kind of peace in this, if you let yourself feel it without judgment. The peace of a room where nothing has to be explained, where the fire is high and the clock is slow, and the evening asks nothing of you that you have not already given it, simply by being the person you are, in the place you are, among the people who are also here. That peace, and it was a real peace, whatever else it was, is what the old clubs were selling, and what the new money was buying, and what neither side ever quite acknowledged was being sold and bought at all. The knife stayed where it stayed. The fork was held as it was held, and the room absorbed another evening, another dinner, another long winter Tuesday in which everything was as it should have been, and nothing required demonstration, and the fire burned at its steady, patient level, and the clock moved forward in the particular way of clocks in rooms that have decided time will take care of itself. The clubs of Philadelphia operated on a timescale different from those of New York, and the difference was instructive. New York's great clubs had been founded mostly in the middle of the 19th century, in the 1830s, the 1850s, the 1870s. They were old enough to have traditions, but not so old that the traditions had become truly unconscious. Philadelphia's clubs were older. The Philadelphia Club, founded in 1834, was not the oldest private club in the country. That distinction belongs to the South River Club in Maryland, founded in 1700. But it was old enough, and its founding was old enough in relation to the great industrial fortunes of the Gilded Age, that it occupied a different position in the social landscape. The Philadelphia Club sat in a red brick building that had the quality of a house that had stopped needing to prove anything about itself sometime in the previous century. The rooms inside were handsome in the specifically understated way that old Philadelphia institutions tended to be handsome. The furniture was old, the portraits were old, the members were not old, some of them were quite young, but the family names on the membership roll were names that appeared in documents from before the Revolution, in the records of a city that had been, for a brief and self-conscious moment, the capital of a new country. E. Digby Baltzell, the sociologist who spent much of his career studying the upper-class establishment of America, used Philadelphia as his central example in his book On the Making of the National Upper Class, precisely because Philadelphia illustrated the principle most clearly. The Philadelphia upper class had, by Baltzell's account, achieved something that New York's upper class was still working toward: the conversion of wealth into a kind of settled institutional authority that no longer needed to defend itself. The Biddles, the Cadwalladers, the Whartons, the Ingersolls, these families did not need to prove that they belonged to the Philadelphia Club. The question would have seemed, in their world, slightly eccentric. Of course they belonged. They had always belonged. The club had been created in part by and for people like them. The consequence was a different kind of exclusion from New York's. Philadelphia did not have the raw drama of the Blackball stories. The John King episode, the Dr. Webb episode, the founding of the Metropolitan Club in response to the Union Club's rebuffs. These things happened in New York because New York was a more volatile, more competitive, more openly mercantile city. Philadelphia's exclusions were quieter and older. They did not generate newspaper stories. They simply were. A man of new money in Philadelphia in the 1870s or 1880s did not receive a dramatic rejection. He received instead a careful and sustained indifference. He might find that the right clubs were not quite accepting applications at the moment. He might find that the men he wanted to know were always somewhat engaged, always pleasant when encountered socially but never quite available for the particular kind of knowing that leads to sponsorship. He might find that his children were welcome at certain schools, but that the school's social connections led, inexplicably, everywhere except the places he needed them to lead. This was the Philadelphia method, and it was in many ways more effective than New York's more confrontational approach, precisely because there was nothing to respond to. A man who has been blackballed can be angry about the specific event. A man who has been quietly ignored has nothing specific to be angry about. He cannot even be certain for some time that the ignoring is deliberate. He might think, perhaps I haven't quite met the right people yet. Perhaps the application process is genuinely slow. Perhaps next year. The Somerset Club in Boston operated on a similar principle. Though in Boston the old families were even more consolidated, even more thoroughly convinced of their own rightness than in Philadelphia. The Boston Brahmin, Oliver Wendell Holmes's term for the hereditary scholarly and professional class of Boston, was a specific cultural type that had no quite equivalent in any other American city. Not simply rich, not simply well-bred, but consciously intellectual and consciously plain. The Brahmin families produced doctors, lawyers, professors, ministers. They were not ostentatious because ostentation, in their self-understanding, was a kind of intellectual failure. They were not conspicuous because conspicuousness was a form of insecurity, and they had nothing to be insecure about. The Somerset Club on Beacon Street received its members in rooms that told you, without saying anything, that the people in them had been educated at Harvard, and the people before them had also been educated at Harvard, and the people before them had founded the institution. This was not a boast. It was simply a context. The rooms said, "We have been here. We have been thinking and talking and reading and arguing and sitting by fires in rooms like this for long enough that the sitting has become what we are." The Irish Catholics who had won political control of Boston in the 1880s were not welcome at the Somerset Club. Neither were the new manufacturing fortunes that had been made in the mills of Lowell and Lawrence. Neither, for that matter, were the Jewish families who had arrived in Boston over the preceding decades, and who were, in many cases, as educated and as professional and as intellectually serious as any family in the club. None of this was stated. It was simply understood. Boltzell wrote that the aristocracy of birth was replaced, in American club culture, by an aristocracy of ballot, the vote of existing members deciding who among the aspirants was acceptable. But what the ballot system concealed was that the ballot itself was a lagging indicator. The real decision was made much earlier, in the invisible processes by which certain families acquired the particular quality of presence that made them plausible candidates for membership, and by which other families, however wealthy, did not. The Boston clubs produced and celebrated a distinctive ideal of the wealthy gentleman that was different from the New York model. In Boston, the ideal was not merely the man of old family, it was the man of old family who had also distinguished himself intellectually or professionally. The Boston Brahmin who had published a book on Roman law, or who had served as a professor of Greek, or who had edited a scholarly journal for 30 years without pay. That man was a greater figure in the club's self-understanding than the man who had merely inherited a great deal and spent it well. The intellectual credential was a way of elevating the aristocracy of old birth to something that felt more justifiable, as if the families had earned their position not just by being there first, but by being there first and being smart about it. This self-congratulatory quality of the Boston upper class was something that New York found slightly amusing and Philadelphia found slightly excessive. New York valued ability, in its way. It had made room for men of demonstrable intelligence and civic distinction regardless of family. Philadelphia valued discretion and stability, but Boston valued the performance of intellectual seriousness as a social credential, and this created its own particular form of the grammar of belonging. At the Somerset Club, you were expected not just to be of good family and of correct deportment, but also to have opinions about things, literature, history, the proper organisation of society, and to be able to express those opinions in the manner of someone who had been thinking about them for a long time and who did not require you to be impressed by the thinking. The Harvard connection ran through everything. To have gone to Harvard was, in Boston, not merely an educational credential, but a social one of the first order. Harvard was where the Brahmin families had always sent their sons, as their fathers had been sent before them, and the institution had developed, over 2.5 centuries, a culture that was recognisably continuous with the club culture we have been describing. The same understatement, the same assumption of belonging, the same capacity to move through a room as if the room had been expecting you. What is striking, looking back at these Philadelphia and Boston clubs from the distance of more than a century, is how thoroughly the people inside them believed in the rightness of what they were doing. This was not cynical exclusion. It was not, at least not primarily, a conspiracy to protect wealth or power, though it served those functions. It was, in the minds of the men and women who maintained it, a genuine attempt to preserve something they valued, a form of social life characterized by understatement, by intellectual seriousness, by the absence of the need to impress. They were wrong about many things. They excluded people on grounds that were, by any careful examination, indefensible. But they were not wrong that the thing they were trying to preserve had value. They were only wrong about who had access to it. There is a kind of sadness in this history too, because what the old money families were trying to protect, the ease of belonging, the quietness of rooms where nothing had to be explained, was precisely the thing that the new money was most hungrily seeking, and the seeking, the hunger, the very need, was what disqualified. The old money had peace because it had never needed to acquire peace. The new money wanted peace but could not help wanting it visibly, urgently, in the way that men who have worked very hard for something want it when they are close to it. The irony of the Gilded Age social wars is this: the men who most needed the peace of these rooms were the men who most completely could not have it, because the peace, in its deepest form, was not a thing that could be given. It had to be something you'd always had. And so the evenings in Philadelphia and Boston went on, the fires in those old rooms burning at the same steady level they had always burned, the conversations in those rooms continuing in the same measured register, while outside the cities changed around them, and the fortunes multiplied, and the world that had produced those rooms slowly, without drama, without any single dramatic announcement, became something else entirely. There was a language spoken in the rooms of the Gilded Age clubs that was not made of words at all. It was made of objects, specifically the objects that the right people owned and the objects they did not own, and the more subtle question of how the objects they owned were treated, presented, and spoken about, or not spoken about, which was often the more telling register. The watch is a good example. Almost every man of consequence in the Gilded Age carried a pocket watch, and the watches available in the 1880s and 1890s ranged from relatively modest timepieces to works of extraordinary craftsmanship that cost as much as a modest house. The new money men tended toward the latter. The watches in their pockets were by Patek Philippe or Vacheron Constantin, bought in Geneva or Paris, gold cases with enamel miniatures on the back depicting hunting scenes or mythological subjects, the kind of watch that, when taken out to check the time, was simultaneously checking the time and making an argument about the quality of the life in which such a watch could appear. The old money men often carried watches of a different kind, not cheaper, often more expensive in the simple sense of monetary cost, but older, a watch that had belonged to a father, and before that to a grandfather, and before that perhaps to a great-grandfather who had received it as a gift from someone whose name the family still remembered. This watch might be showing its age. The case might be worn at the edges. The enamel on the back might be slightly chipped. The workmanship was not in question. It was superb, because when the watch had been made, the best craftsman in the world had made it, and things made by the best craftsmen in the world 100 years ago tend to remain excellent. But the watch looked lived with. It looked as though it had been in a pocket for a very long time, resting against the warmth of successive generations of the same body. This watch, worn, inherited, slightly imperfect in its surfaces but perfect in its function, was a better social credential in the rooms of the old clubs than the most spectacular new purchase from Geneva. Not because old things were inherently superior to new things, but because the old watch told a story that the new one could not, the story of a family that had been in a position to own such a thing for long enough that it was no longer a treasure, but simply an item of daily use, taken in and out of a pocket without ceremony, not because it was not valued, but because it had been valued for so long that the valuing had become unconscious. The same principle applied to houses, to furniture, to the silver on the dining table, to the horses in the stable, to the paintings on the walls. The new money of the Gilded Age was famous for its collecting, for the systematic acquisition of European art, of rare books, of antiquities, of everything that money and energy and the right dealers could assemble. The collections were genuine. In many cases, J.P. Morgan's art collection was not pretense. It was a real aesthetic commitment pursued with real intelligence. But the collection was also inevitably a performance. It was the demonstration of taste rather than its quiet exercise. The old money families had paintings on their walls too, but the paintings had arrived on the walls by a different route. Some had been purchased generations ago by ancestors who had their own reasons for the purchase. Some had been gifts, inherited along with the houses that contained them. Some were portraits of family members, not the grand formal portraits of the new money families, where the portrait itself was a statement about the sitter's importance, but smaller, more intimate pictures that depicted real people in real moments, people whose names were still known in the household because the household had known them in life. The art in the old money houses did not announce its quality. It simply was of quality, because the family had been in a position to own good things for long enough that good things were what they owned. There was no curatorial logic to the collection. It was not arranged to impress visitors. It was not selected to make arguments about taste or culture, or the owner's relationship to European civilization. It was simply there, as it had always been there, filling the walls with colour and surface and the faces of the people the family had known. The Vanderbilts' approach to art was very different, and very honestly stated. Alva Vanderbilt hired architects, decorators and curators to create interiors that were deliberate statements about culture and refinement. The result was extraordinary. The houses were genuinely beautiful, the collections were genuinely excellent, but they were beautiful and excellent in a way that required you to notice. The beauty was pointed. It said, "Look at this. Look at what we have made, what we have gathered, what we know." The old money looked at what the Vanderbilts had made and found it impossible to do what was socially required, to look, to admire, and then to look away, because the house was still asking you to look. There was a version of this in the clothing too. The new money dressed for occasions in a way that the occasions themselves seemed almost to require. Mrs. Vanderbilt at a ball, or Mrs. Astor at an opera, or any of the great hostesses at their own parties, wore gowns that were documented by the newspapers in detail. The fabric, the embroidery, the jewels, the cost when the jewels were spectacular enough to warrant it. The gowns were made by Worth in Paris, or by equally fashionable houses, and they were updated seasonally because fashion was a living thing and the right people wore the current thing. The old money women also dressed well. They also attended balls in fine gowns. But their relationship to fashion was slightly different. It was the relationship of people who could afford to be slightly behind the fashion, who did not need to be absolutely current because their position did not depend on the statement that currency makes. A woman who was absolutely secure in her social position could wear a gown that was 2 seasons old without anyone's opinion of her changing. A woman whose position was less established had to be more careful about these things, had to be current, had to demonstrate through her clothing that she was attending to the right signals. The language of things was also a language of restraint. To have a great deal and to show very little. This was the essential message of old money possession. The house that was large but not ostentatious. The stable that was excellent but not showy. The cellar that was deep and well stocked, but the wine at dinner was never explicitly the point of the dinner. The paintings that were very good but arranged as if by chance, as if they had simply ended up on those walls because someone had to hang things somewhere. All of this restraint spoke the same message. We have so much that we do not need to show any of it to you. Our possessions belong to us, not we to them. The new money's relationship with possessions was reversed. The possessions often belonged in some sense to the project of establishing the family's position, of making the argument about the family's right to be in a certain place in the social world. When the possessions are instruments of that argument, they must be visible, because an instrument that cannot be seen cannot do its work. And when the possessions are visible, when the house is built to be seen, the gown to be admired, the watch to be noticed, something essential changes about the relationship between the person and the thing. The person is no longer using the thing is using the person. The old clubs understood this distinction, felt it, maintained it. They were rooms where things were used, not displayed, where the silver was on the table to hold the food, not to make an argument, where the portraits were on the walls to remember the dead, not to impress the living, where the fire burned to warm the room, not to create an atmosphere. In all of this, the rooms were making an argument of their own. The argument that the highest form of possession was possession so complete and so assured that it required no demonstration whatsoever. The conversation in the rooms of the old clubs was a specific thing, and it is worth describing carefully, because it was one of the primary ways in which the belonging that the clubs existed to create was actually created. Men did not come to the clubs primarily to drink or to eat. They came, in the deepest sense, to talk. Or more precisely, they came to be in a room where conversation of a particular kind was available if desired, and could be declined if not, and where the particular kind of conversation that the room permitted was something they could not reliably find elsewhere. The conversation had several distinguishing characteristics that set it apart from the conversation available in other settings. It was unhurried. This was perhaps its most important quality, and the one most difficult to find elsewhere in the commercial life of the Gilded Age. The men who sat in those rooms in the evenings were, for the duration of their time in the room, not in a hurry. They were not going to a meeting. They were not managing a situation. They were not under the pressure of any deadline or any demand. The conversation could therefore move at the pace it wanted to move, following its own associations, stopping where it stopped, doubling back when it felt like doubling back. This unhurriedness was itself a marker of class, and the clubs knew it. A man who was always in a hurry, who arrived at the club from one thing and was going to another thing, who kept glancing toward the clock and checking his pocket watch with the reflexive anxiety of a man whose time is scheduled and measured and accounted for in ways he cannot ignore. That man was not quite at home in the club's particular rhythm. The club's rhythm was the rhythm of men who had arranged their lives so that time in the evenings was at their disposal. And this arrangement, the arrangement of having unscheduled evenings, evenings where nothing was required, was itself something only certain kinds of wealth permitted. The topics of the conversation in the clubs were specific too, and the specificity was significant. Politics was discussed, but not in the manner of newspapers, not in the manner of advocacy or argument. It was discussed in the manner of men who knew personally the people about whom they were speaking, who had perhaps dined with one senator and corresponded with another, and whose relationship to the political world was the relationship of people who moved near power without needing to exert it publicly. They could assess political events with the detachment of those who understand the mechanism well enough that the mechanism holds no particular drama for them. Business was discussed even more carefully. In the most formal understanding of club culture, business was not to be discussed at all. The club was a refuge from business, and conducting business in the club rooms was, in many of the older institutions, literally against the rules. The steward might politely remind a member that the billiard room was not the appropriate place for the discussion of stock transactions. But in practice, the boundary between social conversation and business conversation was permeable, and what happened in the clubs was not so much a prohibition on business as a transformation of the register in which business was discussed. In the club, business became, through the alchemy of the room and the conversation and the relationships among the men who were speaking, something more like intelligence than transaction. You might sit in the reading room after dinner and find yourself in conversation with a man who had just returned from a visit to Pittsburgh, and the conversation might touch on the condition of the steel industry, and the conversation might provide information that was, by any strict accounting, business information of significant value. But it was not presented as such. It was offered as observation, as the casual sharing of what one had seen, and it was received in the same register, and the transaction, because it was not acknowledged to be a transaction, was something other than business. It was the natural consequence of men who had wide knowledge spending time together. This transformation was one of the most valuable things the clubs provided. The old money family's access to information, through their club connections, through the networks that the clubs made available, through the simple fact of being in regular informal contact with people who knew things, was a form of advantage that did not show up in any formal accounting of wealth, but that contributed substantially to the maintenance and growth of that wealth over time. The information circulated in those rooms was not inside information in the legal sense, though the line between the two was not always clearly drawn. But it was current, it was detailed, and it was available only to the people who were in the rooms where it circulated. The great literary and cultural topics also had their place in these conversations, particularly in the Boston and Philadelphia clubs, where intellectual seriousness was part of the self-image of the institution. A member at the Somerset Club might be in conversation with a man who had published a monograph on Roman law and another who had edited the collected letters of a prominent New England minister, and the conversation might range over history and jurisprudence and the nature of the American constitutional tradition with a genuine substance that the participants valued for its own sake, not as a performance. But even in New York, where the intellectual life of the clubs was less specifically cultivated, the conversation had a quality of substance. The men in those rooms had experience, they had managed enterprises, they had travelled, they had dealt with the actual workings of the institutions that shaped American life. They had things to say, and they said them to each other with the economy of people who trust their listeners to understand what is not said as well as what is. There was also, in these conversations, a great deal of humour, but humour of a specific kind. Not the loud performed humour of the dinner party where a man's wit was on display. Not jokes, exactly. More like the humour that accumulates between people who know each other well and who have developed, over time, a shared set of references and associations from which small, pointed, shared amusements could be extracted without any particular effort. A member might make an observation about a political figure that all those present knew personally, and the observation would contain a detail of characterization so specific and so well placed that the people who understood why it was funny would find it very funny, and the people who didn't understand would not be told. This was the humour of insiders, and it required no performance, no setup, no punchline. It simply was, or it wasn't. The greatest compliment one could pay to a conversationalist in these rooms was not that he was witty, or brilliant, or well-informed. It was that he was good company. Good company was a specific and definite quality that these rooms valued above almost everything else, and it was related to, but not identical with, any of the more obviously demonstrable qualities. A man could be very intelligent and not be good company. He could be very well read and not be good company. He could know a great deal about wine and history and the workings of the American railroad system, and still not be good company if he was in any way effortful about it, if the intelligence or the knowledge was deployed rather than simply present. Good company was the quality of being there, of being genuinely present without demanding anything of the other people in the room, of being able to sit in silence without the silence becoming awkward, of knowing when a conversation had run its natural course and declining to extend it artificially, of finding amusement in things that genuinely amused, rather than things that seemed like they ought to amuse, of having a self that was sufficiently at ease that the self did not require management or presentation. This quality, as good company, is what the old clubs were ultimately selecting for, with all their elaborate mechanisms of admission and exclusion. Not wealth, not lineage, not education, not achievement, but the quality of presence that made a man's company genuinely pleasant over a long evening, in a room where the fire was high and the clock moved slowly and there was nothing in particular that needed to be accomplished. This quality was connected to all those other things, to old money, to the right family, to the right formation, but it was not reducible to them. Some men of old money were not good company, and some men, it must be said, who had grown up without money or old family were very good company indeed. The room could not always keep them out. If the rooms of the Gilded Age clubs could speak, If the panelled walls and the worn carpets and the slowly darkening leather of the chairs could organise themselves into some form of testimony, they would probably speak not in the voices of the members, but in the voice of the steward. The steward was the room's most continuous presence, the person who was there before the first member arrived and after the last one left, who saw everything and noted everything and said nothing, which is perhaps the essential function of memory. Thomas Bridges was the head steward at the Union Club for 23 years, from 1872 to 1895. We know his name from the club's records and from a few mentions in the memoirs of members, but we know almost nothing else about him, which is appropriate. The steward's job required invisibility, and a man who had done the job for 23 years would have been very good at that invisibility. What we know from the records is that he was paid well, that he managed a staff of 12, and that when he died in 1897, 2 years after retiring from the club, he left an estate of a few $1,000s, which was not a large sum but was more than most men of his station accumulated. What Thomas Bridges saw over 23 years at the Union Club would have constituted a remarkable archive of American social history. He saw the rise of the great fortunes and their failed and successful attempts to enter the room he managed. He saw the blackballing episodes and their aftermath. He would have known from the small calibrations of atmosphere in the room which members had voted which way, though he never said. He saw the marriages and the deaths and the divorces and the business failures and the remarkable successes that made and unmade the social landscape of the city during those 2.5 decades. He saw, specifically, the change in the character of the men who came through the door. The men who came in 1872, when he first took the job, were, most of them, men whose families he had heard of before taking the position, men whose names were already in the social history of New York in a way that was simply assumed. By 1895, some of those families were gone, reduced, moved, altered by circumstance in ways that the social fabric could not entirely accommodate. New names had appeared on the membership roll, names that would not have appeared in 1872, because the club had bent slightly under the pressure of the times. The steward's relationship with the members was its own complex thing. He was not a friend. The relationship was not that, and did not pretend to be that. It was something more useful than friendship, a professional intimacy, an intimate professionalism. He knew things about each member that the member might have been surprised to know he knew. Not private things, necessarily, not the secrets that the men kept from their families and from the world, but the daily things, the preferences, the habits, the small signals of mood that a man gives off without intending to, and that an attentive observer reads without effort. He knew, for example, which members were going through difficult periods and which were flourishing. The signs were in the small things, whether a man sat with his usual ease or with a slight tension in the shoulders that betrayed preoccupation, whether he drank at his usual pace or faster, whether he wanted company in the evenings or wanted the privacy of a corner table and a single glass. The steward accommodated all of these states without comment, providing what was needed before it was asked for, finding quietly away from the man who needed solitude, making available the company of the fire and the newspaper, and the room's usual silence. There were members the steward liked and members he found more difficult, though these preferences were invisible in his manner with either. He had developed, over decades, the ability to be equally pleasant to every member, regardless of his actual opinion of the member, which is a skill that requires a kind of social discipline that most people never have reason to develop. The members noticed, of course, those who paid attention, they noticed that Thomas Bridges was always equally warm, equally efficient, equally present, and they took this consistency as the simple expression of professional virtue. Those who thought more carefully about it might have understood that it was something more, the result of a man who had made the room his purpose, and who had subordinated his own preferences to the room's requirements so completely that the preferences were no longer quite visible even to himself. What a steward like Thomas Bridges understood, which the members perhaps could not have articulated even if they had tried, was that the room was a collective achievement. It was not simply the product of the architecture or the furnishings or the quality of the food or the social credentials of the membership. It was the product of everything together, maintained in the right relationship to everything else, by people who understood what the room was trying to do and who worked, day after day, to help it do it. The members provided the credentials and the conversation. The kitchen provided the food. The steward provided the invisible scaffolding that held it all together. When Thomas Bridges retired in 1895 and was replaced by a younger man, several of the long-standing members noticed a change in the room's atmosphere that they found difficult to describe. The new steward was perfectly competent. The food was the same, the rooms were the same, but something in the texture of the evenings was slightly different, a quality that had been present so continuously for so long that it had become invisible, and that became visible briefly, only in its absence. The new steward learned the job in time, the quality returned, or something close enough to it. But for a season or two the room was doing something it had not had to do in a long time, reconstituting itself, rebuilding from its own foundations something that had been disrupted. The room was, briefly, aware of itself in a way that it was not supposed to need to be. The great rooms survive their stewards, of course. They survive the members who filled them, and the particular social moments those members represented, and the specific historical conjunctures that gave the rooms their original purposes. The Union Club is still there, on Park Avenue now, in a building designed in 1933, its sixth home. The Knickerbocker Club is still on East 62nd Street, in the building from 1915, still doing what it does. The Metropolitan Club is still on Fifth Avenue, still with its marble staircase, still with the murals that Stanford White's craftsmen applied in the 1890s. In each of these rooms the fire is burning somewhere, in the particular steady way of fires that are tended by someone whose job it is to tend them. The evening is settling in. A steward whose name we may not know is moving through the room with the practiced invisibility of someone who has learned to be there without being seen. And the room is doing what rooms like this have always done. Holding the evening, holding the people in it, holding the long, patient, unhurried silence that is what the room, in its deepest nature, is actually for. Whatever the world outside the windows has become, and it has become a great many things, some of them inconceivable to the men who built these rooms. Inside the rooms, the evening proceeds in its ancient measured way. The clock turns, the fire settles, and the rooms continue their long, patient work of being rooms, containing things, keeping the world at its proper distance, letting the hours pass in the particular warmth of a place that has decided to remain itself. There was an hour in the afternoon at the Union Club, somewhere between 2 and 4, depending on the season, when the light through the tall windows of the reading room had a specific quality that the regular members knew well. It was the hour when the lunch crowd had gone and the dinner crowd had not yet arrived, and the room had a kind of held breath quality, as if it were resting between its two main performances of the day. The light at this hour in autumn came in at a low angle and lay across the carpet in long, pale rectangles that moved slowly, so slowly that movement was more something you deduced from their changing position than something you could perceive directly. The dust in the light, the particular quality of the afternoon dust in a room that had been inhabited all day, was visible only in these oblique rays, each particle floating with the unhurried buoyancy of something that has no destination and is not concerned about it. 1 or 2 members were typically in the room at this hour, perhaps 3 on a busy afternoon. They sat in their usual chairs, or in chairs that had become temporarily usual through the repetition of this particular time of day. They were not, for the most part, doing anything that could be described with precision. Reading, perhaps, but in the unfocused way of reading that happens in the late afternoon, where the words pass through the eyes and settle somewhere in the mind without being actively processed, a kind of gentle accumulation of sense rather than directed comprehension. The steward moved through this room at a different pace in the afternoon than in the evening. In the evening his movements had a subtle purposefulness. He was managing a room in use, anticipating needs, keeping the balance between availability and unobtrusiveness that the evenings required. In the afternoon the purposefulness was quieter. He moved through the room as he would move through a room in which everything was already as it should be, attending to the details of maintenance that were most easily attended to when the room was quiet, checking the level of the lamps, arranging the newspapers in their proper order for the evening, making small adjustments that no one would notice because the adjustments, if properly made, would leave everything looking exactly as it had before. There was a particular chair in the far corner of the reading room, away from the windows which made the afternoon light less brilliant and more diffuse in that area, that seemed to be claimed by different men on different afternoons, all of them arriving there by some private logic and settling into it with the complete, physical relaxation of someone who has found the right place. The chair was covered in dark green leather, very worn, the surface of the leather slightly softened by years of being occupied in this and other similar ways, and the indentation in the seat was the particular shape of no single body, but of many bodies over many years, a kind of composite human shape, an average of all the people who had sat there and allowed the chair to hold their weight. A man sitting in this chair in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon with nothing in particular required of him for the next 2 hours would find that the room gradually became quieter than it actually was, or rather, that the sounds in it became easier to hear and simultaneously easier to ignore. The tick of the clock on the mantel, the occasional turning of a page in the room's only other occupied corner, the faint sounds from the street outside which arrived through the curtains and the glass and the thick walls of the building as something more like the idea of street sounds than street sounds themselves. The slow breath of the fire, which at this hour had settled to a particular level of steadiness that was between burning well and beginning to need attention. The afternoon had a different relationship to time than the morning or the evening. In the morning, time moved with the urgency of what was required. In the evening, time moved with the deliberateness of what was chosen. In the afternoon, this particular afternoon hour, in this particular room, time seemed to move not at all, or to move in a different direction, or to fold back on itself in a way that made the hour seem both very short and very long simultaneously. The man in the corner chair might look up at the clock and find that only 20 minutes had passed when he would have sworn it had been an hour, or he might look up and find that an hour had passed in what felt like 15 minutes. The afternoon resisted exact accounting. This quality of the afternoon in rooms like these was something that the old club members valued without particularly naming it. They might say only that they liked the club in the afternoons, that there was a good quality about the place between lunch and dinner, that it was restful in a way that was different from the evening's restfulness. What they were describing, if they had been pressed to describe it more precisely, was the experience of time that has been given permission to be itself, time not organised around demands or schedules, time not flowing toward or away from anything in particular, time simply being the medium through which one moved without any urgency or any requirement. The dust settled, the clock turned, the fire breathed, the light moved in its invisible way across the carpet, and the men in the room were present in it without needing to be anything other than present. This was the whole point of the afternoon. This was the whole point of the room, not the important dinners, not the significant conversations, not the social machinery of admission and exclusion and the blackball and the membership committee. All of that was real, and all of it mattered. But underneath all of it, making it possible, was this, the afternoon, the hour when nothing was required, the room when it was simply a room. And in the late afternoon, as the light began to change again, to cool, to blue, to take on the quality of the approaching evening, the room began its slow preparation for what came next. The steward attended to the fire. The lamps were lit, one by one, spreading their amber warmth through the rooms in the old way, the gas or the electric making no essential difference to the quality of what was offered. The evening was coming. The men who came in the evenings would arrive soon, and the room would shift registers again, becoming the social room, the room of conversation and connection, and the careful grammar of belonging. But the afternoon lingered for a moment in the transition. The afternoon quality, the particular quality of a room that has been resting in its own company, that has not been required to do anything for several hours, that quality did not disappear all at once when the evening began. It persisted, like warmth in a stone that has been in the sun, gradually releasing what had accumulated during the quiet hours. The evening would be good. The evenings in these rooms were always in their way good. But the afternoon was something else. The afternoon was the room without its performance, the room without its social purpose, the room simply being a room in the way that old rooms are when no one is requiring anything of them. And the men who knew this quality, who came in the afternoon specifically for it, who understood that the late afternoon in a good club was a specific and irreplaceable thing, those men were among the room's most faithful occupants, not because they needed the room more than others, because they understood it more completely. There are certain acts of pride in history that are so extravagant they become, in retrospect, almost comic. Comic in the way that very large things can be comic, the way a mountain can be comic if you find yourself arguing with it. The founding of the Metropolitan Club of New York in 1891 has this quality. It was an act of wounded pride so elaborate, so expensive, so thoroughly proportionate to the ego of the man who performed it, that it deserves a place in the history of American architecture and in the history of American social wars in roughly equal measure. The man was J.P. Morgan. By 1890, Morgan was arguably the most powerful private citizen in the United States. Not the wealthiest, perhaps, but the most connected, the most feared, the man whose opinion could make or break a railroad, whose word could stabilize or destabilize a market. He was also, by this point, a member of 19 clubs, 19 separate memberships, which is itself a kind of statement about the seriousness with which the club world was taken in these years, and about Morgan's particular appetite for the social landscape of his city. The two men whose blackballing precipitated the founding of the Metropolitan Club were not, in the usual telling of this story, the most dramatic figures. John King was the president of the Erie Railroad, a man of genuine power in the industrial world. W. Seward Webb was the president of the Wagner Palace Car Company and the brother-in-law of William K. Vanderbilt. Morgan had sponsored both men for membership at the Union Club. Both were rejected. The reasons, as always, were not stated. The black balls simply outnumbered the white balls in the box, and that was that. Morgan took this personally. This is worth noting, because Morgan was not, by most accounts, a man who needed the approval of clubs. He was already a member of more clubs than most men would accumulate in a lifetime. He had entree to every significant social institution in New York. He had dined with kings and presidents. The Union Club's rejection of his candidates was, in any practical sense, meaningless. It changed nothing about the actual exercise of his power, nothing about his wealth, nothing about his life beyond that specific rebuff. But it was a rebuff, and Morgan, who burned his personal letters to protect his privacy, and who avoided public speaking because he did not want to be observed being uncertain about anything, was not a man who received rebuffs quietly. The story goes that when he learned of the double blackballing, his response was short. He would build a club. He would build a club so magnificent, so thoroughly expressive of everything the Union Club's fusty restraint had declined to be, that the Union Club would look, by comparison, like a country house that had fallen into disrepair. He would invite every significant man in New York, the Vanderbilts, the Roosevelts, the Gaullis, the Whitneys, and when he had his 700 members and his building on Fifth Avenue and 61st Street, the Union Club could sit in its modest rooms and congratulate itself on the purity of its admission standards. The building that Stanford White designed for the Metropolitan Club was not modest. It was, almost definitionally, the opposite of modest. White took the villaed houses as his reference point and expanded from there, an Italian Renaissance palazzo scaled to the particular requirements of an institution that was not trying to be discreet. The exterior was white limestone, gleaming. The entrance was an arch of the kind that European governments used for public monuments. The double staircase inside was said to be among the finest in New York. The main hall rose 2 stories, with murals and marble, and the particular quality of grandeur that says, money was spent here, and the spending was not embarrassed. The press called it the Millionaires Club, and the name was not entirely wrong. When the invitations went out in 1891, they went to 700 of New York's most prominent men. Most of them accepted. The initiation fee was $250, and the annual dues were $100. Not extravagant by the standards of the men being invited, but enough to make clear that this was not a club for the general public. The membership was assembled with remarkable speed, because Morgan's prestige was such that an invitation from him felt less like a social opportunity and more like a summons. Among the founding members were names that would have been very welcome at the Knickerbocker Club, had the Knickerbocker been interested in welcoming them. Vanderbilts, Roosevelts, Gaulets. The fact that these men were here, at the Metropolitan, rather than exclusively at the older clubs, said something about the shifting landscape of New York's social world. The strictly old money institutions were losing their monopoly on prestige. A room where you could sit with Morgan was not a lesser room, simply because Morgan's grandfather had been a different kind of rich. The Metropolitan Club was, in its own way, as exclusive as the Union Club or the Knickerbocker. It did not admit everyone. It had its own admissions process, its own standards, its own blackball mechanism. But the standards were different, weighted more toward wealth and achievement than toward lineage and the invisible grammar of old belonging. The Metropolitan was a club where you could be new money and still be welcome, provided you were wealthy enough and prominent enough and had, this was important, the kind of manners that suggested you understood how a room like this was supposed to work. This was a subtle but crucial distinction. The Metropolitan did not admit men who ate off their knives any more than the Union Club did. It cared about deportment, about a certain quality of ease, about the absence of the most egregious forms of social striving. What it did not insist on was the specific pedigree of that ease. Whether it had been learned in Newport or in a merchant's house in Pittsburgh mattered less, as long as the learning was thorough enough that the learning didn't show. The founding of the Metropolitan Club shifted the social landscape of New York in ways that took decades to fully unfold. It created a new tier in the hierarchy, a place that was genuinely prestigious, but that opened itself to a broader definition of merit than the older clubs had been willing to entertain. Men who would have spent years working their way toward the Union Club or the Knickerbocker found a more direct route available. And the older clubs, aware that they were competing now in a way they had not previously had to compete, began, slowly, reluctantly over the course of years, to reassess some of their assumptions. This reassessment was not dramatic. The old clubs did not announce a new admissions policy. They did not acknowledge publicly that the founding of the Metropolitan had changed anything. But in private, in the conversations among committee members, in the careful calibrations that preceded the formal Blackball votes, there was a new awareness. The penalty for being too exclusive had become visible. If the old club lost too many significant men to the new one, the old club's prestige would diminish by exactly the measure of the men it had driven away. Morgan himself continued to belong to 19 clubs. He was a member of the Union Club until his death. He was a member of the Knickerbocker. He was a member of the Metropolitan Club, which he had founded. He was a member of the New York Yacht Club and the Century Association and a dozen others. He moved through all of them with the same slightly impatient grandeur, the same burning eyes and enormous moustache, the same sense of occupying whatever room he was in with a completeness that left slightly less room for everyone else. He had made his point about the Metropolitan. The point had been made in marble, and in the endorsements of 700 of the city's most prominent men, and in the architecture of a building that said, without quite saying it, "See what you excluded." The Union Club had excluded it, and the Union Club continued to be the Union Club, and its members continued to sit in their slightly less splendid rooms, and the evening continued in both clubs simultaneously, the fires burning at their respective temperatures, the conversations murmuring at their respective levels, the rooms holding their respective versions of the question, what are we for and who are we for? And does the answer still hold in a world where the money has gotten so large and so new that the old categories are barely keeping up? Outside, Fifth Avenue was becoming something new. The mansions were going up. The gaslight was giving way to electric light. The century was ending. And in the rooms along the avenue, men who were among the most powerful in the world were still, quietly, arguing about who belonged. The great clubs of the Gilded Age produced no handbook. There was no document that explained what was and was not acceptable, no list of behaviours that would result in blackballing, no written code of the kind that one could study and master in preparation for membership. This absence of written rules was itself a rule, perhaps the most important one. The existence of a handbook would have implied that the standards were learnable by anyone with sufficient application. The point was precisely that they were not. What existed instead was a set of unwritten laws that governed everything from how one dressed, to how one spoke, to how one occupied a chair, and these laws were transmitted not through instruction, but through the long, slow process of becoming the kind of person who understood them. A man who needed to be told that it was inappropriate to discuss the price of things at the club dinner table was already, by the fact of his not knowing, demonstrating the problem. The rule was not stated because it did not need to be stated to the people it was meant for. Let's take the question of talking about money. This was perhaps the most fundamental of the unwritten laws. Money was not discussed in the rooms of the old clubs, not in the direct sense of amounts, of profits, of specific financial transactions. A man might mention his investments in the most general terms. One might say one had interests in a particular industry, or that one was involved in a particular enterprise. But the specifics belonged elsewhere, in the offices and boardrooms where business was conducted. The club was not a place for business. It was a place where the results of business could be enjoyed without having to be discussed. This was, if you think about it, a very particular kind of privilege. The privilege of not needing to talk about money. The old money families had arranged their affairs in such a way that the money maintained and grew itself through the management of lawyers and accountants and bankers. The actual work of maintaining a fortune was done by professionals, not by the family members themselves. This meant that the family members genuinely could spend their evenings in the club without thinking about money, because someone else was thinking about it for them. The new money men, whose fortunes were often still in the active stage of being made, carried their money with them more visibly. It was fresher, more present, more in need of attention. When a new money man sat in a club room and found himself thinking about his stock positions or his railroad contracts, he was experiencing something that the old money men around him were not experiencing, and when he occasionally, inadvertently, let those thoughts into the conversation, when he mentioned a deal he was working on or asked a question about the market that implied he was watching it closely, the room noticed, not harshly, not explicitly, but noticed, in the quiet way of rooms that have learned to notice. The second great unwritten rule was about the display of possessions. A member's clothing was expected to be correct, well made, of good material, appropriate to the occasion, but it was not expected to be expensive in a way that was apparent. The old money approach to clothing was to acquire things of very high quality and then wear them for a very long time, so that the quality became, over the years, indistinguishable from shabbiness. A suit that had been made by a good tailor in 1870 and worn consistently through 1885 had a quality that a suit made in 1885, however excellent, could not replicate. It had time in it. It fit in the specific way that clothes fit only after being worn by a single body for years. It had softened in the particular places that body had softened it. It was, in the deepest sense, a perfect fit. New money clothing, by contrast, was new. The Vanderbilts and their contemporaries spent enormous sums on clothing. Worth gowns, bespoke suits from London's finest tailors, jewellery of a quality and quantity that made their wearers, at formal occasions, look something like walking exhibitions of what could be purchased if one had sufficient funds. The old money found this both baffling and faintly embarrassing. Not because the clothing was bad, it was excellent, but because it announced itself, because it required you to acknowledge the money that had made it possible, because it was performing a function, and performance was the thing these rooms were supposed to be a relief from. The rules about conversation extended to self-promotion of any kind. A man was not expected in the rooms of the old clubs to speak at length about his own achievements. He might acknowledge them if directly asked, with a modesty that was expected to be genuine rather than performed, and the difference between genuine and performed modesty was, again, something the room could detect. A man who said, "I've been fortunate," and meant it was different from a man who said, "I've been fortunate," while very clearly hoping you understood just how strategic his fortune had been. The room could tell. The clubs also had rules about how members treated the staff. This is perhaps the most unexpected of the social distinctions. Unexpected because one might have thought that old money and new money would treat servants in similar ways. But the treatment of servants was one of the clearest markers of the social divide. The old money families had lived among servants for generations and had developed a relationship with them that was formal in structure, but often genuinely warm in texture. The steward at the Union Club was not a servant in the way that a footman at a new money house was a servant. He was something more institutional, more permanent, a figure who had been there before many of the members arrived and who would be there after they were gone. New money men sometimes overtipped as a way of establishing warmth that they did not know how to create otherwise. Sometimes they were dismissive or peremptory, having not yet worked out the particular register of easy authority that the old money families had settled into. Sometimes they were unnervingly democratic, treating the steward as an equal in a way that was meant to be kind but that somehow made everyone, including the steward, uncomfortable. The right relationship with the staff, like the right relationship with the room itself, was something that could only be learned by growing up with it. There was a rule about quietness that deserves particular mention. The rooms were quiet, not silent. There was conversation. There was the sound of newspapers and the occasional clink of a glass, but the level of sound was calibrated to something below what most public rooms permit. A loud laugh was noticeable. Not offensive, not cause for reproach, but noticeable in the way that a dropped fork is noticeable. It briefly disrupts the texture of the room and is registered by everyone, and then the room smooths over it and goes on, but the registration has happened. Loud laughter was associated in the social iconography of the era with a particular kind of social energy, the energy of the saloon, the dinner party, the public house. It was the sound of men who were performing their enjoyment for each other, who were measuring the success of a joke by how much noise it generated, who were using volume as a substitute for the subtler pleasures of quiet. The old clubs valued quietness because quietness was the sound of people who did not need to perform, who were simply present without the effort of demonstration. These rules, the rules about money, about display, about self-promotion, about the treatment of staff, about sound, were never enforced. There was no mechanism of enforcement. A man who violated them was not told to leave, not given a warning, not disciplined in any formal way. He simply found over time that the room was slightly less warm toward him, that the conversations he joined ended slightly sooner than others, that when the next dinner invitation was sent around, his name was somehow overlooked. The enforcement was social, which is to say it was total and invisible and without appeal. The men who succeeded in these rooms were the men who had internalized the rules so completely that they no longer experienced them as rules at all. For them, the quietness was simply how a room ought to sound. The understatement of clothing was simply how clothing ought to look. The restraint about money was simply how civilized conversation worked. They were not performing compliance. They were not working at it. They were simply being what they were, in a room that had been made for people who were what they were, and the fit was so complete that the room itself felt to them like home. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. Newport, Rhode Island, in the summer months of the 1880s and 1890s, was something that no other place in America quite resembled, and that Europe could only partially parallel. It was not a resort exactly, though people came to it to rest from the year's exertions. It was not a colony, though it had the quality of a place that had been settled, with great deliberateness, by a specific group of people who intended to remain in each other's company for a specific season. It was perhaps best understood as an outdoor extension of the clubs, the same rooms with different walls and the sound of the Atlantic in the background. The summer houses at Newport were called cottages. This was a usage that contemporaries found funny and that later historians have found informative. The Vanderbilt mansion known as the Breakers, 70 rooms, imported Italian marble, servants' quarters that would have satisfied many American families as their permanent residence, was called a cottage. The Marble House, with its gold ballroom and its Chinese tea house, set in the garden, and its atmosphere of deliberate extravagance, was called a cottage. The Belmont estate, the Ulrichs mansion, the Fish House, all cottages. The word was a joke, and the joke was about the incongruity between the word's pastoral connotations and the reality of what it described. But it was also a claim. We are just here for the season, with our families, in our summer places. We are not trying to impress anyone. This is just where we happen to spend the summer. Newport served a specific social function in the club world. It was where the families that were in the same clubs also spent their summers, in proximity to each other, without the formal structure of the club evening, but with all the same social mathematics operating in the more relaxed register of a seaside afternoon. The lawn at Newport was the outdoor equivalent of the club's reading room. The casino, where tennis was played, and where one went to be seen, was the outdoor equivalent of the club dining room. The ocean itself, the Atlantic horizon, the cool breezes that came off the water in August and made Newport genuinely comfortable when the rest of the eastern seaboard was sweltering, was the backdrop against which the summer's social business was conducted. The social season at Newport was managed with the same precision as the winter season in New York, though the management was less obvious because the setting was more casual. Calls were made and returned. Dinners were given, of a kind that the Newport climate permitted, al fresco, or in the great dining rooms of the cottages, with the windows open and the sound of the ocean coming in from the south. Picnics were organised on the cliffs, in the kind of elaborately managed impromptu style that only people with large staffs can achieve. Drives were taken along Bellevue Avenue in the hours before dinner, the carriages moving at the pace that allowed one to see and be seen, which was the whole purpose of the drive. The social hierarchy of Newport was, if anything, more visible than the social hierarchy of the New York clubs. In the clubs, the hierarchy was expressed through the invisible grammar of belonging: who was a member, who was not, who sat where, who greeted whom with what degree of warmth. At Newport, the hierarchy was expressed through the cottages themselves. the size of your cottage, its position on the cliffs or on Bellevue Avenue, the scale of your entertainments, the quality of your staff. These were visible markers that could be read by anyone who drove along the avenue. The old money resented this visibility because it brought the question of wealth back into the summer in a way that the summer was supposed to make unnecessary. But the new money had brought it, and the new money was building the largest cottages on the most prominent lots, and there was nothing to be done about it except to pretend, with great sophistication, not to notice. Mrs. Astor's cottage at Newport, called Beechwood, was not the largest or the most spectacular. This was entirely deliberate. Mrs. Astor's position in society did not depend on the size of her summer house. Her summer house reflected her social position rather than creating it. She could afford to be modest, architecturally, because she had no need to use architecture to make a point. The Vanderbilts had to use architecture to make a point, and did so with great thoroughness, because the point, that they were here now, that they belonged, that their money was real and their intentions were serious, still needed making. The tension between old money and new money at Newport was, in some ways, more concentrated than the tension in the clubs, because Newport's scale was more intimate. In New York, you could avoid people. In Newport, in the summer, you were always slightly too close to everyone. The same people appeared at the same dinners, the same drives, the same casino entertainments. You could not quite avoid the Vanderbilts if you were spending the summer in Newport, and the Vanderbilts could not quite avoid you. The summer forced a kind of proximity that the clubs could prevent, and the proximity required the social actors to develop more sophisticated ways of managing the tensions that the proximity created. What Newport eventually produced over the course of the 1880s and 1890s was a kind of grudging integration. The old money and the new money spending their summers in the same place, attending many of the same events, acknowledging each other's presence while maintaining through countless small calibrations of warmth and distance, the social distinctions that the clubs maintained in their more formal way. The integration was always partial. There were still hostesses who would not invite certain people. There were still families who arrived in Newport each summer and found, without anything being said, that the social world had arranged itself slightly away from them. But the integration was real enough to show that the process of accommodation, the long, slow work of time on the apparent permanence of social distinction, had already begun. By the early 20th century, Newport had passed its peak as the social centre of American upper-class life. The great cottages were becoming difficult to maintain. The families that had built them were finding that the scale of the operation, the staff, the expenses, the social obligations, was more than the succeeding generations wanted to sustain. The summer colony that had seemed, in 1895, as permanent as any institution in America was revealed, in the light of the next 20 years, to have been a moment rather than a condition, a specific configuration of wealth and social energy that could only persist as long as all the conditions that had created it persisted. When those conditions changed, when the income tax arrived, when the war changed everything, when the next generation found other ways to spend their summers, Newport faded not dramatically but steadily, the way all the best things of the Gilded Age faded, with a certain grace, a certain acknowledgement that the thing had had its time, and that the time was now something else. But in 1890 the time was still itself, the season was still the season. The drives along Bellevue Avenue were still the thing one did in the late afternoon, and the sound of the ocean was still the sound that underlay everything, and the cottages were still full of people who knew each other from the clubs in the city, and who found, in the summer air and the sea light, and the particular informality of a place that was not quite the city and not quite the country, a version of the belonging that the clubs provided in their more deliberate way. The summer world was another room, with different furniture and better weather, and the same essential quality. It was for people who already knew they were supposed to be there. In 1887, a man named Louis Keller began publishing a small volume in New York that he called the Social Register. It was not a long document at first, a list of families, organized alphabetically, with their addresses, their club memberships, and in some editions the names of the educational institutions their children attended. The book was printed on cream-coloured paper with a red and black cover, and it was distributed to the families listed in it and to certain institutions, hotels, clubs, caterers, who had professional reasons to know who was who. The Social Register became, within a remarkably short time, one of the most powerful documents in American social life. To be listed in the social register was to be, officially and publicly, in society. To be excluded was to be, whatever your wealth or your achievements or your connections, outside it. The register was not, in any legal sense, authoritative. It was published by a private company, it used criteria that were never explicitly stated, and it could be ignored by anyone who chose to ignore it. Most people who were excluded did not choose to ignore it. Keller expanded the social register over the years to cover other cities: Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, San Francisco, Baltimore, St. Louis. Each city's register was a document of its own local social hierarchy, and the families listed in one city's register were not necessarily listed in another's. A family that was thoroughly established in Boston might not appear in the New York register, because their connections were Boston connections, and the register tracked the social world of each city with a specificity that reflected the genuine distinctiveness of the social life of each place. The criteria for inclusion in the social register were officially unstated. Keller and his successors maintained that the register simply documented who was in society, without defining what in society meant, which was a position of magnificent circularity. The people in the register were in society because they were in the register, and the register contained the people who were in society. This circularity was not an accident. It was the essential structure of the whole system. The register derived its authority from the fact that it listed people who were already considered authoritative, and the people already considered authoritative derived part of their authority from being in the register. The register was updated annually. New names were added, old names were removed. The removals were the more interesting category. A family might be removed from the social register for a divorce. Divorce was, in the 1890s and early 1900s, a serious social transgression that could result in exclusion from the more conservative institutions. A family might be removed for bankruptcy, or for a criminal conviction, or for some other event that the register's editors considered inconsistent with membership in society. A family might also, more quietly, simply fade out, appear in one edition, be absent from the next, with no explanation offered. The additions were also telling. The pattern over the decades was exactly the three-generation pattern we have already traced. The grandfather, however wealthy, was not in the register. The father might appear if he had managed the family's social trajectory correctly, if he had gone to the right schools, married the right woman, joined the right clubs, conducted himself in the right way for long enough that the register's editors were satisfied that the family had arrived. The son was solidly in, and might find that his membership was so unquestioned that it no longer required thought. The social register had its own relationship with the clubs, which was intertwined but not identical. Club membership was one of the strongest indicators of social register eligibility, and the register listed its members' club affiliations for exactly this reason. But club membership alone was not sufficient for inclusion. A man could be a member of the Metropolitan Club and still not appear in the social register, if the other markers of social standing were not in place. Conversely, a man might be listed in the register without belonging to the top-tier clubs, if his family history was sufficient and his conduct was correct. The women's clubs and social institutions maintained their own versions of the register: invitation lists, guest books, the accumulated records of who had been called upon and who had called, who had been invited to the important parties and who had not. These records were not published, but they were real and they were consulted. The hostess planning a dinner for 20 people had in her mind, or in a notebook somewhere, a list of names that were acceptable and names that were not, and she managed these lists with a precision that would have satisfied a military quartermaster. All of this, the register, the club memberships, the invitation lists, the summer colonies, the portrait galleries, the inherited watches and the worn carpets and the stewards who knew your name, formed a single, massive, self-referential system of documentation. The system documented who belonged, and belonging was determined by whether you were in the system. The circularity was complete. There was no outside reference point from which you could establish your eligibility. You could only become eligible by being found eligible, and you were found eligible only by people who were themselves already inside. This is why the 3 generations were necessary. The first generation made the money, but they also made the first acquaintances, the first connections, the first modest entries into the system. They joined the lower-tier clubs, they gave to the right charities, They sent their children to schools where the children of established families were also sent. They began the process of being documented. The second generation, raised in the system, continued the work. More club memberships, better schools, marriages into families that were more established. The third generation inherited a social position that had been built patiently over 60 years, and they found that the system had absorbed them so completely that the documentary record showed, to anyone who looked, a family that had simply always been there. The architecture of exclusion was, in the end, an architecture of time. You could not rush it. You could not buy your way to the front of it. You could not leverage your way around it by building a better opera house or a more magnificent club, because the opera house and the club could create alternative institutions but could not substitute for the original ones. The original ones had the documentation, the years of records, the accumulated memberships, the long trail of invitations extended and accepted and reciprocated, the chain of social obligations created and fulfilled, the portrait in the corridor and the brass plate in the library, and the name on the membership roll that had been there for 30 years. The social register was the most visible manifestation of this architecture, but it was not the architecture itself. The architecture was built of years, and years, as everyone who has needed them has discovered, cannot be purchased or accelerated or received as a gift. They can only be spent, and the spending of them, patient and sustained and correct in all its details, was the one currency that the old clubs accepted without reservation, and that no amount of new money, however enormous, could replicate on any shorter schedule. In a quieter corner of the Union Club's reading room, in an old copy of the Social Register from 1890, you might find the evidence of all this. The names, the addresses, the club memberships, the institutional connections, each name representing a family and a history and a choice made over decades about how to live and where and with whom and to what end. Each name a small, quiet document of belonging. There is a specific quality of humiliation that comes from being told no by people you have already surpassed, by every ordinary measure of success. The men who were blackballed from the Union Club in the 1880s and 1890s, or who were quietly discouraged from applying, or who applied and waited in silence while the answer arrived in the form of continued silence, these men were, in many cases, among the most consequential figures in American life. And the no they received was not a no about their abilities, or their intelligence, or their financial acumen, or anything that the outside world valued. It was a no about something they had not been born to, and could not acquire, and could do nothing about. John King, whose Rejection from the Union Club produced the knife story, was the president of the Erie Railroad at the time of his rejection. The Erie was not a small enterprise. It was one of the major trunk lines connecting New York to the interior of the country, and managing it required genuine executive ability of the kind that the railroad business, with its enormous logistical complexity and its constant financial pressures, demanded and developed. King was good at what he did. He was good enough that J.P. Morgan thought him worth sponsoring for membership at the most prestigious club in New York. The men who blackballed him, we don't know who they were because the vote was secret and the secret was never broken, were not on the whole more competent than King in any domain that the world recognized. Some of them were very intelligent. Some had distinguished themselves in the law, or in finance, or in civic life. But others were simply men who had been born to good families, and who had spent their lives in the comfortable maintenance of inherited position. The inherited position was, by the logic of the club, sufficient. The railroad management was not. The humiliation was felt. Morgan felt it, though he did not say so directly, and his response, the founding of the Metropolitan Club, was the most elaborate revenge in the history of American social life. But other men felt it too, less dramatically, and responded in ways that were less visible but no less revealing. Some withdrew. They decided that the old New York social world was not worth the effort of seeking admission to, and they turned their energies elsewhere, to other cities, to other activities, to the company of men who cared more about what you could do than about what your grandfather had done. Others persisted for years or decades in the gradual accumulation of social capital that might eventually produce the desired admission. They supported the right charities. They appeared at the right events. They sent their children to the right schools and managed the children's social lives with an eye to the connections that would eventually make the family's position unassailable. They played the long game, which was the only game the system permitted. The long game had its own dignity, though it was a dignity with an edge of melancholy. A man who spent 30 years quietly accumulating the social credentials that his money alone could not provide, who attended every right thing, supported every right cause, married every connection correctly, and raised his children to marry them more correctly still. That man, at the end of 30 years, might find himself in possession of the very access he had spent his life working toward. And then what? The rooms that had seemed, from the outside, to contain everything he wanted, the ease, the belonging, the quiet confirmation of his arrival, might, from the inside, prove to be simply rooms, with fires and chairs and men reading newspapers, as rooms generally are. Several of the great Gilded Age fortunes went through exactly this arc. The patriarch worked his way to the edge of the social world he wanted to enter. The children worked their way slightly further in. The grandchildren were inside, looking round at the rooms their grandfather had wanted, and finding that the rooms were very pleasant, but that the desire, having been satisfied, no longer organised anything. The great social project, the decades-long campaign of connection and accumulation and careful conduct, was over. What came next was just life. Cornelius Vanderbilt himself is the clearest case. The original Commodore, Cornelius I, was not a man who cared about the Union Club. He was a man who built ferries and then steamships and then railroads, who accumulated a fortune that by his death in 1877 was estimated at over $100 million, and who was famously indifferent to the social niceties that his contemporaries in old money New York prized. He was rough in his manner and direct in his speech, and he ate the way he ate, and he did not apologize for any of it. The Union Club and the Knickerbocker Club and the whole edifice of the old New York social world were institutions that he could have bought several times over and never bothered to acquire. His descendants were different. His son, William Henry Vanderbilt, who inherited the fortune and doubled it, was more interested in social position and began the process of establishing the family's social credentials that his children and grandchildren would continue. By the time of the Breakers and the Marble House, and Alva Vanderbilt's famous 1883 ball, the Vanderbilts were engaged in an energetic and expensive campaign to win the social acceptance that the Commodore would not have bothered to seek. They won it eventually. But the winning took decades and cost, not in money, because money was never the issue, in something harder to measure, the sustained effort of people who had not needed to make that kind of effort in any other domain of their lives. The men who were told no were, in the end, told no by a system that had decided its own continuity was more important than their individual merits. This was the system's original function, not to reward merit, but to preserve a particular kind of room, with a particular quality of membership, against the constant pressure of a world that was producing new kinds of wealth, and new kinds of men, at a pace the room could not accommodate, without ceasing to be what it was. Whether the room was worth preserving on those terms is the question that the whole history of the Gilded Age social wars raises, and does not quite answer, because the people who most confidently believed the room was worth preserving were the people who had the least reason to question the belief. The men who were told no knew better, perhaps. They knew the room from the outside, which gave them a perspective that the men inside the room did not have. They knew that the room was not simply a room, but a claim about which kinds of lives and which kinds of wealth and which kinds of families had the right to the particular form of peace that the room offered. They were arguing that the claim was wrong, or that it should be applied more broadly, or that they met the standard even if the standard was not quite what it claimed to be. These were reasonable positions. The room heard them, in the muffled way that rooms hear everything said outside them, and the room remained the room. The fire in the room burned all that winter, and the evenings passed, and the clock on the mantel moved in its small, steady, inexorable way. And outside the door the city continued, enormous and various and not at all organised around the standards the room maintained, and somewhere in the great unresting night of the Gilded Age, a man who had been told no was still at his desk, still working, still building the thing that he hoped would eventually be enough. The clubs did not close exactly. They were open 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, because they housed some members who lived in the club buildings themselves, and because the concept of a private club included the concept of a private refuge at any hour. But there was a closing of the evening, a moment, somewhere between 11 at night and 1 in the morning, when the last man who had been using the club rooms either retired to a bedroom upstairs or went out through the front door into the dark city, and the steward's staff began the quiet work of resetting everything for the following day. This work happened in silence, or near silence. The sound of glasses being collected, of chairs pushed back to their proper positions, of ashtrays emptied and fires damped. The room that had been inhabited for 6 or 8 hours returned, by stages, to the condition of a room waiting to be inhabited. Neat, ordered, the physical evidence of the evening's activities removed or diminished, the surfaces restored to their prepared state. The morning began before the first member arrived, which on a working day might be 8 or 8:30, though the club was available earlier for those who wanted breakfast before going to their offices. The kitchen was the first room to come alive, beginning the preparation of the breakfasts and lunches and dinners that the day would require. The dining room was set. The reading room's newspapers were laid out. The Times, the Herald, the Tribune, and for the clubs with more cosmopolitan memberships, a selection of English papers that arrived a week late on the steamers from Southampton, but that were nonetheless valued for the perspective they offered. The fire was laid before the first member arrived, ready to be lit at the right moment. In winter it was lit early. In spring and fall, the judgment depended on the temperature, and the steward made the call based on experience, on the particular feel of the morning, on whether the day was the kind of day that made a fire feel welcoming or the kind that made it feel excessive. These calibrations were small, but they were not insignificant. The fire was part of the room's welcome, and the welcome had to be calibrated to what the room was welcoming people into, which varied with the weather and the season and the particular quality of the day. The newspapers were an important part of the morning ritual and deserve particular mention. The reading room in the morning had a quality quite different from the reading room in the evening. In the morning, the papers were fresh, and the reading was purposeful, men checking the financial news, reading the political dispatches, looking for the particular information that would shape the work of the day. The morning conversation was different from the evening conversation, briefer, more specific, more directly connected to the things that needed to be attended to. Men spoke of what they had read, commented on this development or that, offered a quick opinion, and moved on. By 11 in the morning the reading room was beginning to thin. Men had gone to their offices, to their banks, to their meetings. The clubs had a mid-morning quiet that was different from the evening quiet, not the settled quiet of people who had arrived at their evening and were content to remain in it, but the quiet of an institution between its morning and its afternoon energies, a quiet of transition and potential. Lunch brought a different crowd from either the morning or the evening, men who had come from their late morning appointments, who had an hour or two before the afternoon required their attention again, who wanted something to eat and somewhere to eat it, that was not a restaurant, with a restaurant's exposure and noise and the particular quality of being seen in public that the clubs existed in part to relieve. The lunchtime conversation was businesslike in a way that was socially acceptable at noon, but would have been inappropriate after 8. Deals were referenced, positions were mentioned, the commercial texture of the day was present in the dining room without quite taking it over. The afternoon had its own character. After lunch several members typically stayed, men who had flexible afternoons, whose work did not require their physical presence at a specific office for the full working day. These might be men with private investment portfolios that managed themselves, or men whose professional roles were of the kind that consisted more of being available than of being specifically productive at a specific time. They read, they played billiards, they wrote letters in the writing room using the club's notepaper, which had the club's address embossed at the top, an address that was, for many purposes, as useful as their own addresses, since the club was the place where they spent a significant portion of their time and where messages reached them reliably. The members who lived in the club buildings, and several of the great clubs had residential apartments for members who wanted or needed to be in the city without maintaining a full household, had a particular relationship with the institution. The club was not just their social home, it was their physical home. They woke in the morning to the sounds of the club rather than the sounds of a family household. They ate in the club's dining room rather than at a family table. Their mornings began and their evenings ended in a building that was simultaneously their private residence and a shared institution maintained by and for 30 or 300 people, depending on the club. This existence had a quality of efficiency that certain kinds of bachelor life or widower life found very congenial. Everything was managed, everything was maintained, There was no household to run, no staff to supervise, no domestic decisions to make. The club made all of that invisible, providing the conditions of comfortable domestic life without any of the work, and without the company or the connection that family life provided. The men who lived in the clubs were often men who had found, for various reasons, that the company of the club was sufficient. Some of them had been married and were no longer. Some had never married. Some simply preferred the club's company to the company of a family household. The club accommodated all of these situations without asking questions. The very late evenings, after midnight when the dining room was long closed and only the reading room and perhaps the billiard room retained any population, had a quality that was distinct from everything that had come before. The men who were still there at 1 a.m. were there for their own private reasons. They might be sleeping in the chairs, the kind of deep, club chair sleep that is possible only in a place where one has been comfortable for a long time. They might be reading with the intensity that comes late at night when the day's demands have finally receded and the book is all there is. They might be in a late conversation, the kind that happens when the social obligations of the evening have been discharged, and what remains is something more genuine. The conversation of 2 or 3 men who, having run through the surface subjects, have arrived at something deeper and more personal. These late conversations were the ones that the clubs were perhaps most essentially for. Not the formal dinners, not the card games, not the reading of newspapers in orderly rows, but these, 2 or 3 men, long past midnight, in the embers of an evening that has run its full course, saying things to each other that they might not say in daylight. The room made these conversations possible by providing, over the course of the earlier evening, the ground of trust and comfort from which the later honesty could emerge. This is what the rooms were for. This is what the long evenings were building toward. And this is what was lost, or changed, whenever the rooms changed. Because the late conversations depended on everything that had come before them, and everything that had come before them depended on the room being reliably and continuously itself. The story of the old money clubs cannot be told without the story of the opera, because the opera was where the same dynamics that animated the clubs played out in a more public and more architecturally dramatic setting. The Academy of Music on 14th Street was the old money's cultural stronghold in New York in the 1870s and 1880s, the place where the Knickerbocker families attended in their boxes, where the social season was conducted in the most visible and most ritualized form that the era permitted. And the Academy of Music is where the limits of old money's control first became, and remained, a matter of extraordinary public comedy. The boxes at the Academy of Music were the equivalent of club membership translated into performance. To hold a box at the Academy was to be, publicly and permanently, one of a defined group of families who had secured their place in the social landscape of New York. The boxes were inherited. They were not sold. There was no formal waiting list. There was simply the understanding that when a box became available, the decision about who received it was made by the existing box holders, in the same quiet, self-referential way that the clubs made their membership decisions. The Vanderbilts wanted a box. This was entirely understandable. By the early 1880s, the Vanderbilt fortune was one of the largest in the country, and the Vanderbilts had been doing everything that money could do to establish their place in New York society. They had built houses on Fifth Avenue. They had entertained on a scale that made other entertainments look tentative. Alva Vanderbilt's 1883 costume ball, for which she spent an amount that rivaled the annual budgets of small municipalities, was one of the social events of the decade. But they still did not have a box at the Academy of Music, because the families who controlled the Academy had decided, collectively, and without the need to say so directly, that the Vanderbilts were not quite ready. This was, by any rational measure, an absurd position. The Vanderbilts were richer than most of the families who held boxes. They were more socially active. They were not, in any meaningful sense, less respectable. But they were new money, in the specific sense that their wealth had been made, in the memory of living people, by Cornelius Vanderbilt, who had run a ferry service and had been rough and combative and not particularly interested in the niceties of social convention. The children and grandchildren of Cornelius Vanderbilt had smoothed many of those rough edges. But the memory of the roughness remained, and the old families at the Academy clung to that memory as justification for a position that had become in any objective sense indefensible. The Vanderbilts responded to the rejection from the Academy of Music the way Morgan would later respond to the rejection from the Union Club, by building a rival institution. The Metropolitan Opera House, which opened in 1883 at 39th Street and Broadway, was financed by a group of men who had been denied boxes at the Academy, or who had simply grown impatient with the Academy's proprietorial attitude toward a performing arts institution. The Metropolitan had 70 boxes, far more than the Academy, and the families who purchased those boxes were, in many cases, the exact families that the Academy had found insufficiently established. The Metropolitan Opera became, within a very short time, the most important opera house in New York. Not because its productions were better, though they were often excellent. Not because its building was more beautiful, though it was impressive, but because the money that had been invested in it, and the social energy that had been attached to its boxes, made attending the Academy of Music look, gradually, like the kind of thing that people did when they could not get into the Metropolitan. The old money had built the Academy. The new money had built something bigger and more splendid, and the simple fact of size and splendour was, in this case, enough. This was the lesson that the old clubs were beginning to absorb in the 1880s and 1890s. You could not maintain exclusivity indefinitely against people who had the resources to simply build their own exclusive institutions. The strategy of the closed door worked as long as there was no alternative door. When the alternative door was opened, when the Metropolitan Club offered a room that was genuinely prestigious, or when the Metropolitan Opera offered boxes that were genuinely desirable, the old institutions suddenly found themselves competing for relevance in a way they had not anticipated. The old money families who had controlled the Academy of Music boxes did not, for the most part, abandon the Academy. They continued to attend. They continued to dress for the performance and to sit in their boxes and to be seen in the manner of people who are seen because they have always been seen and who see no reason for this to change. But the audience at the Metropolitan was growing, and the performances at the Metropolitan were drawing the best singers in the world, and the social geography of the city was shifting around the old money boxes at the Academy in ways that made the Academy feel for the first time slightly peripheral. The Academy of Music closed as an opera house in 1886, unable to compete with the Metropolitan. This was not primarily a financial decision, it was a social one. The social weight of attending the Academy had diminished, because the social weight of attending the Metropolitan had grown, and there was not enough of New York's attention to sustain both. The opera needs an audience, and the audience follows prestige, and prestige is not a fixed property, but a living thing that redistributes itself according to where the most significant people are spending their evenings. There was something almost poignant about the Academy's closure, if you were inclined to find it so. The rooms where old New York had attended performances for decades were given over to other uses. The boxes where the Knickerbocker families had sat through countless seasons of grand opera, boxes that had seemed, when the Academy was built, as permanent as anything in New York, became, in a relatively short time, places where the audience for travelling theatrical companies sat in democratic rows without boxes, without the visible social architecture of old belonging. The Vanderbilt story illustrates something important about the limits of the old money strategy. The strategy depended on scarcity, on the fact that there was only one Academy of Music, only one Knickerbocker Club, only one set of boxes that meant what those boxes meant. When the new money had the resources to create abundance, to build new institutions that competed for the same cultural and social significance, the scarcity disappeared, and with it, the ability to maintain exclusivity through simple possession of the existing institutions. The clubs were more resilient than the opera, because the clubs had something the opera did not. They were genuinely private. No one could attend the Knickerbocker Club without being a member. You could not buy a ticket and sit down. The Metropolitan Opera could pull audience away from the Academy because it offered a comparable experience to a public that was free to choose between them. The Metropolitan Club could not pull members away from the Knickerbocker in quite the same way because Knickerbocker membership was not for sale on the open market. It was only for those who had been found acceptable by the existing membership, and the existing membership continued for decades to apply a standard that kept most of the new money out. But the pressure was real, and it was felt, and it changed the atmosphere in the old rooms in ways that were subtle but persistent. The conversations grew slightly more careful on certain subjects. The membership committees began to look more closely at cases they might once have dismissed without serious consideration. The definition of acceptable began, slowly, to accommodate a broader range of backgrounds, as long as those backgrounds came with sufficient polish and sufficient time. The long evening at the Academy of Music was over. The room where old New York had been seen was no longer the room where old New York was seen, and somewhere in the social mathematics of the city, a calculation had shifted that would take another generation or two to fully register. The world that the old clubs had been built to protect was still there for the moment, but it was there the way a landscape is there after the light has already begun to change, present, recognisable, and already in some essential way altered. There was a formulation, quoted in various forms by various observers of the Gilded Age social scene, that went something like this: the first generation makes the money, the second generation spends it, the third generation enters the Knickerbocker Club. The formulation was comic in intent but serious in observation. It was describing something real about the way American wealth and social acceptance related to each other, something about the time scale on which the conversion from money to belonging operated. Frederick Lewis Allen, writing about the social history of the 9 great lords of creation, Morgan, Rockefeller, Harriman, and the others who had built the structures of American industrial capitalism, traced this pattern with specific data. John D. Rockefeller, the nation's first billionaire, joined the Union League Club. His son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., belonged to the University Club, a step up. His grandson, John D. Rockefeller III, reached the pinnacle with membership in the Knickerbocker Club. 3 generations, 60 years, from the man who made the money to the man who was made by the money. This trajectory, Union League to University Club to Knickerbocker, was not accidental. It mapped the social hierarchy precisely. The Union League was the club of Republican respectability, of men who had done things and were known for doing things. The University Club was the club of education and professional distinction, a step toward intellectual respectability, a kind of credentialing that softened the associations with pure commerce. The Knickerbocker was the club of lineage, of time, of the settled authority that only accumulated slowly. The pattern worked because each generation did not try to skip to the level above what they had earned. John D. Rockefeller did not attempt to join the Knickerbocker. He understood, or had been helped to understand, that the attempt would fail and that the failure would be remembered and would make the eventual success of his descendants harder to achieve. By accepting the Union League gracefully, by not forcing the question of the higher club, he allowed his children and grandchildren to inherit a reputation for appropriateness, for understanding the rules, that was itself a valuable social asset. This was the patience the old clubs demanded, not the patience of waiting for something you deserved but were being denied unjustly, the patience of accepting that the thing you wanted operated on a different timescale than the things you were used to acquiring. Money could be made quickly. The position that came from money could not be acquired at the same speed. It had to age, like the room itself had to age, like the furniture had to age, like the name on the family's box at the opera had to age. Time was the essential ingredient, and time could not be purchased. There were men, of course, who tried to accelerate the timeline, who donated enormous sums to the right causes, gave gifts to the right institutions, employed the right architects and the right decorators and the right social advisors, and arranged their lives around the requirements of social acceptance with the same systematic application they brought to the business problems that had made their fortunes. Some of them succeeded, partially and eventually. Some of them failed. The ones who failed tended to fail because the very thoroughness of their application gave them away. The calculation was visible, and visible calculation in these rooms was a disqualification. Ward McAllister's own career is the most instructive example of what happens when the social climber is so skilled that he reaches the summit, and then discovers that the summit is a different kind of place than he had imagined. McAllister had spent decades cultivating Mrs. Astor, making himself indispensable to her, building his reputation as the supreme arbiter of New York society. He had achieved, by the early 1890s, a level of social prominence that was genuinely impressive. He was known everywhere. His opinions about who was or was not acceptable were quoted in the newspapers and taken seriously in the drawing rooms. But McAllister had made one fundamental error. He had made his ambition visible. He had made the social climb itself a spectacle, a performance, a subject of public discussion. The genuine old money found this, in the end, as uncomfortable as anything the new industrialist did. Because the old money's self-conception was not that they had climbed to where they were. They had not climbed. They had simply been there, always. McAllister's very visibility as a social arbiter was a reminder that the social world he was arbitrating was a constructed thing, a set of rules that someone had made up and someone could unmake, and that reminder was deeply unwelcome. Mrs. Astor eventually dropped McAllister entirely. The official reason was vague, some feeling that he had overstayed his usefulness, or that his recent memoir had been indiscreet, or simply that the social season could manage itself without his constant supervision. The real reason was more fundamental. He had become, by his own success, a mirror that the old money did not want to look into. He reflected back to them the artificiality of the whole enterprise, and the reflection was not flattering. The 3 generations rule operated not just for individual families but for institutions. The Metropolitan Club, so gaudy and defiant in its founding moment, so much a declaration of wounded pride and limitless resources, began to age. Within 20 years of its founding, it had become an established institution. Within 40 years, it was one of the great clubs of New York, spoken of in the same breath as the Union Club and the Knickerbocker. The marble that had seemed so aggressive in 1891 seemed, by 1930, simply correct. Time does this to things. It neutralizes the original gesture, covers the original wound, makes the arrived look like the arrived long ago. This is the great equalizer in the long history of money and social position in America. Not legislation, not revolution, but time. The long, patient working of time on the appearances of things. The fortunes that had seemed dangerously new in 1875 were simply old money by 1925. The men who had been excluded from the Knickerbocker Club were dead, and their grandchildren were, in some cases, members. The room had accommodated what it could not stop, and in accommodating it, had converted it slowly and without announcement into the thing the room had always been made of. The 3 generations rule suggests something both comforting and melancholy about the American relationship with old money and new money. Comforting because it implies that the distinction is not permanent, that the passage of time and the right conduct over that time can convert new money into old. Melancholy because it implies that the conversion takes so long that the man who made the original fortune will not live to see it complete. He built the thing. He paid the price of exclusion, of the closed doors and the blackballs and the social arithmetic that said his money was too new. And then he died, and his children negotiated the middle ground, and his grandchildren walked through a door that had been held against him as if he had never been turned away at all. The Rockefellers are the clearest example, and perhaps the one that says the most about what these rituals of exclusion were actually for. John D. Rockefeller was one of the most consequential men in American history. His decisions shaped the American economy for generations. He accumulated, at his peak, a fortune that represented something like 2% of the entire American GDP. And he could not get into the Knickerbocker Club, because his money was too new, because his grandfather had been a farmer, because the men who decided such things had decided in their collective wisdom that the timeline had not yet elapsed. And then it elapsed, without drama, in the ordinary way of time, and the room opened for his grandson, and the rule was satisfied, and the story moved on. The fire still burned. The leather chairs still held the weight of the people in them. The room was still the room, and the name on the membership roll was Rockefeller, as if it had always been there. The great clubs of the Gilded Age were, with very few exceptions, exclusively male. This was not a rule that needed to be stated. It was simply the nature of the institution, as thoroughly understood by everyone as the function of the blackball or the importance of the unwritten code. The club was a place where men could be among men, and the absence of women from the rooms was not experienced, by the men in those rooms, as an absence at all. It was the condition. The Union Club had embedded in its history a small and quietly absurd example of how thoroughly the female exclusion was maintained. For a century, a full century, no lady had entered the club unless she was a female employee or the wife of the club president, and the wife of the club president was permitted to visit only once, on a specific morning when the club was otherwise empty, for the sole purpose of viewing her husband's portrait and determining where it had been hung. That was the full extent of female access. One visit, one woman, one portrait. The visit was presumably brief. This story is told with a kind of affectionate amusement by the club's own historians, as if the extreme nature of the restriction somehow tips into comedy. But it was not comic in its original intention. It was simply the architecture of a world in which the private spaces of men and the private spaces of women were organised around different principles and different purposes, and in which the club was specifically and deliberately the most male of the male spaces. The women of the Gilded Age responded to this exclusion in several ways. Some simply accepted it, or rather, occupied themselves so thoroughly with the management of their own parallel social world that the men's clubs were not a deprivation they felt. The drawing room, the afternoon call, the organised dinner party, the subscription ball, these were territories that women controlled, and the social authority exercised in these territories was real and consequential. Mrs. Astor's ability to determine who was or was not part of the 400 was not diminished by the fact that she could not attend the Knickerbocker Club. She did not need the Knickerbocker Club to exercise social power. Other women founded their own clubs. The 1880s and 1890s saw a proliferation of women's clubs across American cities, institutions that owed something to the gentleman's club model, but that were oriented in many cases toward purposes beyond mere sociability: literary study, civic improvement, professional support for women entering the workforce. The Colony Club in New York, founded in 1903, was perhaps the most socially prominent of these, but there were dozens of others, in every major city, offering women a version of the institutional belonging that the men's clubs offered men. The women's clubs had their own admissions politics, their own hierarchies, their own versions of the Blackball drama. The Colony Club, which drew its founding membership from the top tier of New York society, was as careful about who was admitted as any gentleman's club. A woman whose social position was unclear, or whose family was too new, or whose husband had made his money in a way that did not conform to the colony's standards, would find the admissions process at the colony just as opaque and just as unforgiving as the equivalent process at the Knickerbocker. The social wars of the Gilded Age, in other words, were conducted on two parallel fronts: the men's clubs and the women's social institutions, and the battles on both fronts involved the same fundamental question: who belongs here, and how do we know? The women's battles were in some ways more visible, because women's social life was more public, conducted in drawing rooms and at dinner parties, and at balls where the exclusions could be observed by anyone who was invited and who noticed who was not. Caroline Astor's management of the 400 was the most visible exercise of social exclusion in the Gilded Age, and it operated in the female social sphere rather than the male club sphere. The 400, the legendary list of the only people in New York who really mattered, was maintained by Mrs. Astor, with a rigour that was, in its own way, as exacting as the Knickerbocker's membership standards. A family that was on the list occupied a different social world from a family that was not on the list, and the boundary between the two worlds was maintained by the same mechanisms of silence and withdrawal and gentle unavailability that the men's clubs used. The Vanderbilts' famous entry into Mrs. Astor's world, achieved through Alva Vanderbilt's 1883 costume ball, which was so magnificent and so eagerly anticipated that Mrs. Astor felt compelled to send her own visiting card in order to secure an invitation for her daughter, was, in the history of the Gilded Age social wars, one of the clearest examples of new money successfully storming old money's gates. But the storming was accomplished not through force, but through theatre, through the creation of an event so spectacular that the old money could not afford socially to be absent from it. This was the paradox at the heart of the Vanderbilt social strategy, and at the heart of all the new money social strategies of the era. The strategy that succeeded, the costume ball, the Metropolitan Opera, the Metropolitan Club, was always a strategy that relied on the very conspicuousness of wealth that the old money found objectionable. You could not use understatement to buy your way into a world that prized understatement above all else. You had to use what you had, which was spectacle, and you had to use enough of it that the old money's determination to stay away became, finally, a greater social liability than their determination to maintain the purity of their circle. The women's social institutions eventually became somewhat more permeable than the men's clubs, or rather, they became permeable on different terms, and the terms were negotiated differently. A woman who had married well, even if she had not been born to the right family, could sometimes work her way into the Colony Club, or into the orbit of the right hostesses in a way that was not available to a man who had not been born to the right family. Marriage, in the women's social world, was a conversion mechanism in a way that it was not quite in the men's club world. The men's clubs were about lineage. The women's social world was, at least in part, about who you had become, which is slightly different from who you had always been. The grand hostesses of the era, and there were several who competed for the title in the years after Mrs. Astor's decline, understood that their power lay in the invitation to dinner, to the ball, to the reception. The power to extend or withhold the invitation was the power to include or exclude, and it was exercised with the same careful attention to the social landscape that the men's clubs exercised in their admissions processes. The hostesses knew, with extraordinary precision, who needed to be seen with whom, who was rising and who was falling, which connections were valuable and which were dangerous, which new money was acceptably managing its newness and which was not. All of this, the men's clubs, the women's social institutions, the hostesses' networks, the opera boxes, the summer colonies at Newport and Bar Harbor and Lenox, formed a single ecosystem of belonging and exclusion. The parts reinforced each other. A family that had been admitted to the right men's club had an easier time getting its daughters invited to the right debutante events. A family whose daughters had been invited to the right debutante events had an easier time getting its sons sponsored into the right clubs. The system was self-reinforcing, and its self-reinforcement was maintained by the same people who benefited from it. That is the nature of these systems. They maintain themselves not through conspiracy, but through the accumulated weight of individual preferences, each of which seems perfectly reasonable from the inside. Of course, one prefers to be among people one is comfortable with. Of course, one sponsors into the club only men one is confident will be accepted. Of course, one includes on the guest list only people one has reason to believe will be welcome. None of these preferences, taken individually, looks like exclusion. Together they are a complete architecture of it. And the women in those drawing rooms, pouring tea from silver pots into porcelain cups, knowing exactly who was and was not on the list, knowing exactly which families had been asked and which had been overlooked. They were as much the architects of that world as the men who sat in the leather chairs in the rooms we have been describing. The fire burns in both rooms. The evening holds them both. The question of what the old clubs were actually afraid of is worth asking, because the answer is not as simple as it might appear. The surface answer, that they were afraid of new money diluting the prestige of their institution, is true but incomplete. Prestige was part of it. But there was something else underneath the prestige question, something that becomes visible if you look carefully at the specific language the old members used when they talked about the threat that the new money represented. They were afraid, in a word, of change. Not change in the abstract, but a very specific kind of change. The change in the character of the room that would occur if the room's composition changed. They had built these clubs as refuges, from the speed of commercial life, from the noise of the city, from the constant pressure of demonstrating and competing and acquiring. The room was valuable precisely because it offered relief from those pressures, and the men who brought those pressures with them, who could not put them down when they walked through the door, who sat in the chairs still thinking about their deals and their positions and their standing in the market, those men were, in a very real sense, bringing the outside inside. This is not a trivial concern. The kind of relaxation that the old clubs offered, the deep animal relaxation of being in a room where nothing is required of you, is fragile. It depends on the collective agreement of everyone in the room to maintain it. One person who cannot put down his performance, who is always, in some subtle sense, working, can change the atmosphere of a room for everyone, not dramatically, not obviously. But the texture shifts, the air is slightly different, the conversation takes on a slightly different quality. The old members were protecting something real, a specific quality of being together that they had created over decades, and that they understood, correctly, could not survive exposure to the full commercial energy of the Gilded Age. They were not wrong that admitting the most aggressive of the new money men would change the character of the room. They were only wrong in thinking that the character of the room was more important than the principle of fairness to the men who were being excluded. There was also, underneath the aesthetic concern about the quality of the room, a more explicitly political anxiety. The Gilded Age was a period of extraordinary economic change, and the men who had made the new fortunes were, in many cases, men who had reshaped the structures of the American economy in ways that the old money families found alarming. The railroad barons, the oil men, the steel magnates, These were men who had demonstrated that the economy could be organised in new ways, that old hierarchies could be disrupted by sufficiently concentrated capital and sufficiently aggressive will. That was frightening, if you were someone whose position depended on the old hierarchies. The club was, in this reading, a kind of defensive line, a place where the old economy's human representatives could maintain, among themselves, the social structures that their economic power was no longer quite sufficient to maintain in the world at large. By keeping the new money men out of the room, the old money maintained the symbolic hierarchy, the idea that their kind of wealth was superior, more legitimate, more properly grounded in the right kind of history, even as the actual balance of power shifted against them in the real economic world. This defensiveness was visible in some of the most extreme positions taken by the old clubs during the peak years of conflict. The Knickerbocker Club's insistence on British and Dutch Protestant descent was, by the standards of even the Gilded Age, remarkably narrow. It excluded not just the new industrial fortunes, but also the German Jewish banking families, the Lehmanns, the Goldmans, the Saxes, the Warburgs, who were, in many cases, as thoroughly assimilated into elite American life as anyone else, and whose exclusion was based not on any question of manners or deportment, but simply on religion and origin. This was the ugliest face of the old club's exclusion policy, and it is worth acknowledging directly. The social discrimination of the Gilded Age was not limited to the question of new money versus old. It was entangled with racial and religious discrimination in ways that the admirable social positions of some individual club members did not mitigate. The same rooms that excluded men for being too ostentatiously wealthy excluded other men for being Jewish, or Catholic, or for having been born in the wrong country. These were not separate phenomena. They were part of the same system of exclusion, operating on the same principle. Some people belong here, and others do not, and the definition of belonging is maintained by the people who are already inside. The Jewish banking families of New York and Boston and Philadelphia built their own clubs, as they had built their own parallel social institutions in every domain where the old money establishments were closed to them. The German Jewish community in particular had, by the 1880s, a complete set of social institutions, clubs, summer resorts, schools, charitable organizations, that mirrored, in their structure and their social functions, the institutions of the Anglo-Protestant establishment. The parallel was close enough to be almost ironic. The same architecture of exclusivity, the same careful admission standards, the same concern with who was and was not the right sort. There is a quality of inevitability about this replication. The logic of the exclusive club, once established, reproduces itself wherever exclusion is practiced. You exclude us, so we build our own room. Our own room develops its own standards. Those standards exclude others. The others build their own rooms. The rooms multiply, each one carrying the original logic of the club, the logic of belonging as a form of protection, and each one, eventually, developing the same anxieties about preservation and change that animated the rooms that excluded it. What the Gilded Age clubs were afraid of, in the end, was the same thing they themselves embodied, the power of organised wealth to reshape the social landscape. They had used that power, in their founding moment, to create institutions that protected a specific social world. Now other organised wealth was using the same power to challenge those institutions. The mechanism was identical. Only the people holding it were different. The old club survived, and they survive still, though in forms that their 19th century founders would find only partially recognisable. Women are members now, in most of them. The requirement of Dutch or British Protestant descent has been quietly set aside. The racial exclusions that were once explicit have been removed, and the remaining informal social pressures operate under a different language and a different set of justifications. The room has changed while insisting on its own continuity, which is the way rooms survive. But the original question, what the clubs were actually afraid of, has a simpler answer than all of this. They were afraid of the night when someone walked in who didn't know how to be there, who sat in the wrong chair and spoke too loudly and looked at the price of the wine and asked the steward a question that implied he didn't know the steward's name. They were afraid of that one person, because that one person would change something that had taken a very long time to build and that could not, once changed, be quite fully restored. That fear was real. That it was used to justify unjustifiable exclusions does not make the original fear false. It only makes the response to it wrong. Let's follow a single evening through one of these rooms in more particular detail. Not an exceptional evening, not one of the evenings that became famous or that generated any record worth preserving, but an ordinary Tuesday in February 1888, which is to say one of the 10,000 evenings that the old clubs accumulated over their long histories, and that, taken together, constitute the actual substance of what these institutions were. A member arrives at 6:30. He comes in from the cold. February in New York is cold in a specific way, the cold that comes off the river and wraps itself around the buildings on the avenues, finding the gaps in the coat and the collar with a persistence that is almost personal. He gives his coat and hat to the attendant who has been here for 9 years and who knows the coat and hat without needing to be told anything. He walks through the entrance hall at the pace of a man who has come home, which is what the club is for him, a second home managed on his behalf. He goes to the reading room first, which is his habit. He takes the chair nearest the fire on the left. This is his chair, in the sense that no one else takes it when he is here, which the attendants understand without having been told. He picks up the Times from the table nearest the chair. He has already read it this morning. He's not reading it so much as keeping it in his hands while his mind settles from the day. After perhaps 20 minutes, the secretary of the club comes in, sees him, and exchanges a few words. This is another member, a man of similar age and similar habits, whose family the first man has known for 30 years. They discuss briefly a matter pertaining to the club's upcoming annual dinner, a question of seating that needs to be resolved before the invitations go out. The question is settled in 3 minutes. They both return to their reading. At 7:15, a younger member, new to the club in his early 30s, the son of a man who was here for 30 years before him, comes in and sits in a chair across the room. He has brought a letter he means to answer, and he writes it at the writing desk near the window, pausing occasionally to think, the pen held still above the paper in the specific posture of a man composing something he wants to get exactly right. No one speaks to him. This is understood. When he is finished, he puts the letter in the envelope provided and seals it. The attendant will send it. The dining room opens at 7:30. The first member takes his usual table, near the centre of the room, not at the window and not against the wall, a position that is neither prominent nor retiring but simply comfortable and well situated. The menu tonight is simple: a clear soup, a fish course, a roast, a pudding, cheese. The wine is a Burgundy that the steward has selected in the usual way, presenting it without comment, because comment would imply that the selection was remarkable rather than simply correct. Over dinner another member joins him, an old friend, one of those friendships that have been going for so long that the friendship itself is no longer quite a fact, but simply a condition of life, the way the club itself is a condition. They talk about a mutual friend who is ill. They talk about a property question that affects a family both of them know. They talk for a few minutes about a speech in Congress that one of them read about and the other has not. The conversation is easy and unhurried, and would be entirely unremarkable to anyone listening except in this, that the ease is real, not performed, and the two men in it know the difference. After dinner they return to the reading room. The fire has been tended during dinner and is higher now, the room warmer. One man reads. The other falls into a light sleep, the kind that comes after a good dinner in a warm room, and this is perfectly acceptable, because the club is a place where this kind of sleep is not embarrassing, but simply comfortable, one of the privileges the room extends without requiring acknowledgement. By 10 o'clock the room has thinned. 2 other members who came in after dinner have gone. The young man with the letter left at 9. The friend who dined departs at 9:30 with a brief farewell that requires no ceremony. The first man stays a while longer, reading something he has been reading for 3 weeks, and that he finds, each time he returns to it, exactly where he left it. Not just in the physical sense, the bookmark in its place, but in the sense of his own relationship to the material, which is patient and unhurried and willing to wait. He leaves at 10:15. The attendant brings his coat and hat. The street outside is cold and quiet, a Tuesday night in February, the avenue mostly empty. He walks the 2 blocks to his house. The evening has asked nothing of him that he did not give it willingly. It has offered him warmth, food, the company of a friend, and a few hours of the particular kind of ease that only comes from being somewhere that knows who you are. This is what the club provides. This is what it has always provided, It is not a dramatic thing. It is simply a thing that, over the course of a life, turns out to matter very much. It is a winter evening, let us say 1895. The Knickerbocker Club is settled into its particular evening rhythm, the one that differs from the afternoon rhythm, and from the weekend rhythm, and from the summer rhythm, when half the membership is in Newport or the Hudson Valley and the rooms have a quality of suspension, of the held breath between seasons. A winter weekday evening at the Knickerbocker has its own texture. The city outside has been dark since 5 o'clock, and the cold that comes off the avenue in those months is the particular cold of New York. Not as cold as Boston, not as grey as London, but with a quality of sharpness that the city's density seems to concentrate and direct at anyone who walks its streets. The men who come into the club from that cold come in gratefully. The transition from the dark, cold street to the lit, warm room is one of the better physical experiences available in the city, and it is not lost on the men who experience it every evening. The steward at the door has been there for 12 years. He is not old, he is perhaps 45, but he has the quality of people who have held a position so long that they have become part of the position. He knows, at the sound of a footfall on the steps outside, whose footfall it is. He knows the interval between the step and the door that means someone is checking their hat before entering. He knows which members prefer to be greeted and which prefer to come in quietly without ceremony. He opens the door at the right moment, or he does not open it and lets the member open it himself, and this distinction, so small as to be almost invisible, is part of the service he provides. Inside, in the reading room, 4 men are seated at various distances from the fire. One is reading a newspaper, The Times, folded to the financial pages, though he has not moved his eyes in some minutes. He may be asleep. His breathing is regular, and his posture is that of a man who has learned to sleep in a chair without appearing to sleep. This is a skill the club encourages, or rather does not discourage, because a sleeping man in a chair is not a problem, and the avoidance of problems is one of the things the club does best. Another man is writing a letter. He has been writing it for half an hour and has filled 3 pages in a small, dense hand. The letter is to his brother in London, who manages the family's affairs there, and it concerns a property they jointly own in the Hudson Valley, and whether the tenants have renewed or whether new tenants will need to be found. This is not a business matter, in the sense that it does not involve commerce in any active form. It is the management of what has already been acquired, the maintenance of the landscape of a life. The club is a good place to write such letters. The atmosphere encourages the kind of unhurried attention that the task requires. A third man has just arrived. He is perhaps 60, a man of the kind that these clubs produced in abundance, lean, well-dressed in a way that is unremarkable, with the slightly abstracted look of someone who has come from one world, the world of his offices, his meetings, his active day, and is in the process of arriving in another. He speaks briefly with the steward. A glass of something is requested and brought. He settles into a chair near the window, a chair that has been, it seems, empty and waiting, though no one reserved it. The club operates with this quality of readiness. Things are in order before they are asked for. The 4th man is young, 28 perhaps, a member of recent standing. He is reading a book, a novel, which is slightly unusual in this room where most of the reading is newspapers and correspondence. And he is reading it in the way of young men who have not yet lost the ability to be entirely absorbed by a book, who have not yet developed the habit of reading while simultaneously attending to other things. He is here because his father was a member, and his grandfather before that, and the fact of being here is, for him, entirely natural. He came into the room the way a fish comes into water. These 4 men, in their varying relationships to the room and to the evening, are the room's evening population at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday in January of 1895. By 8, there will be more, men coming in from dinners or from the theatre, or from the long day of whatever their day involves. By 9, some of the earlier arrivals will have left. By 10, the room will be quieter again, the fire lower, the reading more genuine and less performed. By 11, the club will begin to empty toward its nighttime state, a few men left in the later hours, the steward's manner shifting slightly toward the end-of-day mode that is almost imperceptibly different from the rest of the evening. What is happening in this room, at this moment, is not dramatic. That is the point. The room has been designed, over the decades of its existence, to make undramatic things possible. The fire is there not to be noticed but to be warm. The chairs are there not to be comfortable in some conscious, attentive way, but to be forgotten, which is the deepest comfort. The steward is there not to be admired, but to be useful in ways so well calibrated that his usefulness is invisible. The young man with the book will think about this evening differently in 30 years, if he thinks about it at all. Then he thinks about it now. Now it is simply his evening, one of many evenings in a place he has always known. In 30 years, if the world he inhabits has changed as much as the world changed between 1865 and 1895, the evening might look different in retrospect, more specific, more particular, more clearly a product of a specific moment in a specific place in a specific version of the world. The man at the window with his whiskey is thinking about something that has nothing to do with the room. He is thinking about something that happened at his office this afternoon, an argument about the management of a trust that has not been fully resolved and that sits in his mind with the quality of an unfinished sentence. The room has not entirely displaced it. The room has placed it at a distance, which is all the room can do. It has created the conditions in which the thought can be set down for a while if he chooses to set it down. Whether he chooses is up to him. This is perhaps what the old money men who built these rooms understood, and the new money men who were trying to enter them did not yet understand. That the room could offer conditions but not content. It could create a space in which a certain kind of being was possible, but it could not provide the being itself. The ease that the old money members carried with them into the room was not given to them by the room. It was brought by them from outside, from their families and their histories and their long practice of being who they were. The room received it and gave it back amplified, and that amplification was the club's essential gift. A man who entered the room without that ease could not find it here. He might find a reasonable facsimile. He might find the conditions in which ease was theoretically possible. But the original thing, the deep settled ease of not needing anything from the room that had to be generated elsewhere, the rooms knew this. The rooms had always known it. That was why the door was, in its quiet way, so firmly held. The fire settles. The man with the newspaper has definitely fallen asleep now. The young man turns a page. The letter writer blots his final page and folds the letter with the practiced efficiency of a man who has done this 10,000 times. The man at the window finishes his glass and signals, by some movement too small to describe, that he would like another. The steward is already moving. It is 7:15 on a January evening in 1895. The room holds everything it has always held, and the night is long. The world that produced the Gilded Age clubs began to change before the Gilded Age had formally ended, and the change, when it came, did not announce itself with the drama that the preceding tensions might have suggested. It came quietly, as most fundamental changes do, through a series of adjustments so gradual that no single one of them felt like the end of something. The First World War was the clearest dividing line. Before the war, the world of the old clubs, the world of Mrs. Astor's 400, of the Academy of Music Boxes, of the Blackball and the three-generation rule, was still operating more or less as it had been operating for decades, battered by the new money and by the competitions that the new money had generated, but still operating, still maintaining itself, still able to claim that the distinction between old and new was a meaningful and socially significant distinction. After the war, the world had changed in ways that made certain distinctions suddenly difficult to maintain. The men who had fought in the war, and many of the sons of the old money families had fought, as had many of the sons of the new money families, had shared an experience that cut across the social taxonomies of the clubs. A man who had served beside someone in France had a kind of knowledge of that person that no amount of social manoeuvring could replicate or entirely override. The war was a great leveller in this specific sense. It put men in situations where their family names were irrelevant and their characters were not. The post-war world was also a more fluid world, economically. New fortunes were being made in new ways, in automobiles, in entertainment, in communications, in industries that had not existed before the turn of the century. The grandchildren of the men who had been blackballed from the Union Club in the 1890s were now making their own fortunes, in industries where the old family names of the Knickerbocker Club held no particular competitive advantage. The economy was reshaping itself in ways that the old social hierarchy could not quite keep pace with. The clubs adapted slowly. The adaptations were not announced. The membership committees began to weigh certain factors differently. the three-generation rule was not formally revised. It simply began to be applied with more flexibility. A family that had been in America for 2 generations instead of 3 might find the path to the better clubs somewhat shorter than it would have been in 1890. A man whose grandfather had been a labourer, but who had himself been to the right schools and who held himself in the right way, that man might find a sponsor willing to put his name forward, where in an earlier era he might have been quietly discouraged. The social registers, which had been among the most explicit expressions of the old money hierarchy, began to change. The social register, which had been published since 1887, and which listed the families considered to be in society in New York and a dozen other American cities, dropped thousands of names and added others over the course of the 20th century, tracking the shift in what the social establishment considered acceptable. The changes were never large in any single year. Over decades they were transformative. The women's social institutions changed faster than the men's clubs, as a general rule. The Colony Club had admitted women on the basis of social position rather than lineage alone, and this meant that the pool of acceptable members was already somewhat larger. The women's clubs were also, in many cases, more oriented toward activities that brought in new people, literary programs, civic projects, charitable work. And these activities tended to expand the social circle in ways that a purely recreational club did not. Newport, the summer colony that had served as the annual theatre of Gilded Age social competition, began its long decline as the social centre of American elite life sometime in the 1910s and 1920s. The great houses, the Breakers, the Marble House, Belcourt Castle, were expensive to maintain and no longer served their original function. The family that had built them could no longer fill them with the right people, because the right people had dispersed to other places, other activities, other forms of summer life that did not involve the specific rituals of Newport. The Breakers, Cornelius Vanderbilt II's 70-room cottage on the Newport Cliffs, was eventually given to the Preservation Society of Newport County. It became, in time, a museum. Tourists walk through it now in groups, following guides who explain the history of the rooms and the lives that were lived in them. The ballroom where Mrs. Vanderbilt once determined the social landscape of American life is now a place where schoolchildren stand in rows and learn that rooms like this once existed, and that they were used for purposes that the rooms themselves have long since outlived. The Metropolitan Club, founded in such a fury of wounded pride, became one of the most respected clubs in New York without any particular moment of formal acceptance. It simply aged, and aging conferred the legitimacy that birth had once conferred exclusively. By 1920, no one would have thought of calling it the Millionaires Club. It was simply the Metropolitan, with its marble staircase and its murals and its history, a history that had been long enough by then to serve the same function that family history had served for the old Knickerbocker families. The Knickerbocker Club itself continued and continues. It is still there, on East 62nd Street, in a neo-Georgian building designed in 1913 by William Adams Delano. The membership is smaller than it once was, but the character of the institution is by all accounts recognisable to anyone who knows what it has always been. The admissions process is still private. The standards are still unwritten. The room still has the quality of a room that knows who it is, that does not need to explain itself, that holds the evening the way it has always held the evening. The men who sit in those rooms now are the grandsons and great-grandsons of men who might have been blackballed from the Union Club in 1890. Some of them are the sons of immigrants. Some of them are people whose families were specifically and formally excluded from institutions like the Knickerbocker for much of the 20th century. The room has changed in ways that its founders would find startling, and it has remained itself in ways that its founders would find completely recognisable. Both things are true at once, the room holds them. This is the long unwinding of the Gilded Age social wars, not a revolution, not a formal surrender, not a dramatic moment of reckoning, but a series of small adjustments made over many decades by institutions that were too durable to be swept away, and too intelligent to remain entirely unchanged. The door opened, gradually, for more and more people. The definition of one of us expanded gradually to include more and more of the people who had once stood outside it. The pace was too slow, and the exclusions in the meantime were too real and too damaging to be excused by the eventual opening. But the opening happened, and it happened in the ordinary, undramatic way of institutional change, without announcement, without acknowledgement, almost without anyone noticing. And the rooms remained. The fires in them continued to burn, the chairs continued to hold their weight, the stewards continued to know the members' names and their preferences, and to be there before they were needed, and to bring the right thing at the right moment. The unwritten rules continued to exist, though some of them had been rewritten, in practice if not in the club's consciousness, over the course of many decades. It is a winter evening still. The fire is high, and the room is warm, and the night is moving at the pace of a room that has been here for a long time, and expects to be here for a long time more. The details of the story have changed. The names on the membership rolls are different names. The world outside the windows is unrecognisably different from the world outside the windows in 1895, but the room, in its essential quality, the quality of a place that knows what it is, that offers the specific and irreplaceable comfort of belonging, the room is still the room, and the evening holds. It would be a misreading of the Gilded Age social world to see the clubs as its primary mechanism. The clubs were the men's side of the social machinery, and they were important. But the women's side, the drawing room visits, the calling cards, the dinner party seating arrangements, the debutante presentations, the afternoon teas, the subscription balls, these were the machinery's other half, and in some respects the more intricate half, because the women's social world was conducted with fewer written rules and therefore required more sophisticated navigation. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, Mrs. Astor, always Mrs. Astor, the definite article of social New York, is the figure who stands at the centre of this world, but she stands there not because she invented it, or because her authority was unchallenged, but because she happened to be the woman who occupied the position of supreme social arbiter at precisely the moment when the tensions of the Gilded Age made such an arbiter necessary. The tensions created the need. Mrs. Astor filled it. She was not, in her background or her manner, a spectacularly unusual person. She came from the Schermerhorn family, who had been in New York for generations and who occupied exactly the kind of position that the Knickerbocker Club was founded to protect. Old family, moderate wealth, the particular combination of social stability and invisibility that characterized the genuine old money. She married William Backhouse Astor Jr., which gave her the most resonant name in New York's social history and access to a fortune that dwarfed her family's own. What made her remarkable was her will, the specific, sustained daily exercise of social will that was required to maintain the position she claimed and that she maintained, without apparent effort, for several decades. This will expressed itself primarily through the managing of her guest lists, through the decisions about who was invited to her dinners and balls and who was not, and these decisions were made with a precision that the men's club committees might have envied. The calling card was the basic unit of the women's social world, and its exchange followed rules that were as precise and as unwritten as anything in the clubs. When a family arrived in New York or returned to the city at the beginning of the social season, the women of the family sent calling cards to the women of other families who were in their social world or in the social world they aspired to enter. The cards were left at the door by a footman, the family was not necessarily at home, and personal delivery was not required. What was required was the card itself, which served as a form of social registration. I am here, I am available to be known, I acknowledge your existence in the social world. The response to a card was itself a decision. You returned the call, or you did not. Returning a call was an affirmation. It said, I acknowledge you, I am willing to have you in my social world. Not returning a call was a message that required no words and left no evidence, but that was received by the person who had sent the original card as clearly as any written response could have communicated. The silence was the answer, and the silence, like the black ball in the club box, was irrevocable and unexplained. Mrs. Astor's decisions about which cards to return and which to leave unreturned shaped the social geography of New York as surely as the club membership committees shaped it from the male side. Her decisions were felt throughout the network of the city's social life, because the women who were in Mrs. Astor's circle followed her cues, not because they were required to, but because her judgment was understood to be reliable, and following her judgment was a way of maintaining one's own position within the circle she defined. The Vanderbilts' famous entry into Mrs. Astor's world was a story about this system responding to pressure it could not maintain against. The Vanderbilts had been in New York for a generation, and had been spending their money on the right things: the houses, the entertaining, the charitable donations, the social participation at the level at which they were already accepted. They wanted the next level. Mrs. Astor had been unwilling to give it, and then Alva Vanderbilt threw the ball of 1883, and the ball was so important, so much the event that everyone in New York wanted to attend, that Mrs. Astor sent her card and received her invitation and attended. And the question was settled. The settlement was an important moment in the social history of the era, but its importance was not what the newspapers suggested, not a simple victory of new money over old money, not a capitulation by the old guard to the forces of the new wealth. It was something subtler. It was the moment at which the social world acknowledged that the Vanderbilts had spent enough time and done enough of the right things and managed their enormous wealth with enough social intelligence that the cost of continuing to exclude them was higher than the cost of including them. The system remained intact. The Vanderbilts had simply become, over a decade or more, the kind of people the system was willing to include. This is the essential mechanism that ran beneath the dramatic surface of the Gilded Age social wars. Not drama, not rupture, not the old order being swept away by the new money, but a slow, careful, patient process of accommodation that operated at the pace of social time, which is to say very slowly, with many small steps and no single defining moment, until the thing that had seemed impossible had simply happened, and no one could quite say when. The women who ran this machinery, not just Mrs. Astor, but the dozens of hostesses in every city who maintained the drawing room networks that constituted the other half of the social world, were, in their way, performing a kind of work that was as demanding and as skilled as anything the men in the clubs were doing. It was different work, less formal, less institutional, more dependent on intuition and personal judgment and the continuous maintenance of relationships. But it was real work, and it was consequential, and the women who did it well were not simply ornamental figures in the social pageant. They were its organisers. What they organised, the meetings, the meals, the introductions, the carefully managed proximity of the right people, was the human infrastructure of a social world that the clubs provided the institutional framework for. The clubs gave the men a room to be in. The women's social world gave everyone a reason to move between rooms, a structure within which the encounters that mattered could happen and could be given meaning. Together, they constituted the social life of an era that was, in all its complexity and its contradictions, deeply organised around the question of who belonged and who did not. And the fire burns in the drawing room too this evening. Lower than in the club's reading room, perhaps. The drawing room fire is a different kind of fire, more decorative, more attentive to the room's appearance than its temperature, but warm enough that the women who sit near it, the hostess and her 2 or 3 friends who have come to call, who will stay for tea, who will leave after an hour with the particular satisfaction of an afternoon well spent, are comfortable, are at ease, are in the particular state that well-managed social occasions produce. The feeling that one is exactly where one is supposed to be, with exactly the people one is supposed to be with, doing exactly what the hour requires. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. The fire in the reading room is low now, not out. It will not go out, someone tends it through the night, part of the long institutional memory of a place that has been doing this for a very long time. But low and steady, the kind of fire that is there for warmth rather than light, for presence rather than performance. The rooms are quieter now. The evening has moved past the part of itself that required anything. The men who came in from the cold street have long since left or settled into the particular stillness of the late night. The stillness that is different from all the other stillnesses of the day because it does not have something coming after it. The chairs hold their shapes. The leather is dark and warm and very old in places, and the warmth it holds is not the warmth of the fire alone, but the warmth of the many people who have sat in these chairs over the many years, whose warmth has somehow remained in the material of the thing, the way the smell of old wood smoke remains in old walls. The windows are dark. Outside, the city continues in its way, which is not the way of this room. The city is fast and loud and full of people who are performing various things for various audiences. In here, all of that is at a distance, at such a distance that it is almost abstract, the idea of a city rather than the city itself. The clock on the mantel keeps its steady count, which is the only evidence in this room at this hour that time is actually moving. It does not feel as though time is moving. It feels as though the room has arrived somewhere, some destination it has been approaching for many decades, and has settled there in the way that things settle when they are finally where they were going. You are here in this settling. You're here in this room that has held so many evenings, so many arguments and silences and conversations, and long stretches of nothing in particular. The room does not require you to be anything. It has held everyone who has sat in it, and it holds you now in the same patient way without distinction. The carpet under the chairs has the softness of something that has absorbed many years of quiet occupation. It is the colour of old claret, faded at the edges near the windows where the light has had its effect over many seasons. It does not call attention to itself. It simply is there, doing what a good carpet does, holding the room together, giving it a floor, absorbing the sound that might otherwise collect and harden into disturbance. The steward has made his last round of the room. He has checked the fire and found it satisfactory. He has gathered the last glass left on the side table. He has replaced the newspaper that was left open on the reading stand with the afternoon's paper, folded neatly at the front page, ready for whoever comes first in the morning. These are small things. They are the things that make the room possible. The fire is lower still. It breathes in its slow way. The coals at the centre are deep orange that darkens at the edges. There is enough heat in the room now to carry the evening through to morning without the fire needing to do very much more. The room has been warmed to a temperature that the walls will hold. The warmth is banked, like the fire itself, ready to receive the morning when it comes. Outside, somewhere above the city, clouds are moving. They have been moving since afternoon, bringing what might be snow, or might only be the suggestion of snow, that quality of winter sky that promises something without quite delivering it, that holds the air in a kind of suspension between one kind of weather and another. Inside the room, none of this registers. The curtains are drawn. The room is its own weather, its own atmosphere. The fire is low now. The room is warm. The night is long and gentle and asking nothing of anyone. You can let everything go now, in the way that things go when the room is ready to hold them. You can set it down. You can let the evening take it. The clock turns, the fire breathes, and the long quiet night receives you. There is something to be learned from a room that held its shape for a long time, in the face of pressure to change, and that then changed anyway. Not all at once, not dramatically, but by the slow accumulation of small adjustments, each of which seemed modest at the time, and that together amounted to a transformation. The rooms of the old clubs are like this. They are still recognizable as themselves. They have the same chairs, more or less, the same quality of light, the same atmosphere of rooms that have been rooms for a long time, but the people in them are different, and the world outside them is different, and the specific system of meaning that gave these rooms their particular character, the elaborate social architecture of old money and new money, and the claims each made on the definition of belonging, that system has dissolved into history. What has not dissolved is the underlying human need that the system served, however imperfectly and however unjustly. The need for a room where you are known, where your presence is expected and received without the work of explanation or demonstration, where the evening can simply be an evening, without the labour of social performance that most evenings in most rooms require. This need is ancient and persistent, and the Gilded Age clubs were one specific historical response to it, a response shaped by the particular conditions of a particular era, and carrying the particular injustices of those conditions, but also genuinely serving something real. The fire is very low now, the room is very quiet. Outside, whatever the city is doing, it is doing it at a distance that the walls maintain. The evening is at the place in itself where the evening turns towards sleep, where the thoughts that have been moving through the mind slow their movement and the mind begins, gently, to set things down. You can set it all down now, the history, the arguments, the elaborate social machinery of who belonged and who did not, and what the belonging cost and what was lost in the exclusions. You can set down the portraits in the corridor and the silver on the table and the steward's patient knowledge, and the sound of the fire and the weight of the old leather chair. It has all been here, it has all been said. The evening has held it, and the evening is ready now to let it go. The clock on the mantel makes its small, steady count. The room breathes, and the long night opens quiet and dark and very wide, and everything that was heavy becomes light, and everything that was complicated becomes simple, and you are simply here, in the warmth of a room that knows you, at the end of a long day, settling into sleep. If you like this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And here's something to think about. If you could belong to any private club in history, not for the connections or the prestige, but just for the room itself, the fire and the quiet and the particular feeling of being somewhere that knows who it is, which one would you choose, and why?